John Pritchard had spent 11 years with the National Park Service, and in that time, he'd developed what his colleagues called the system. Everything had a protocol, every situation a logical response. Missing hikers meant search grids, probability mapping, and statistical analysis of human behavior in wilderness conditions. His Garmin Montana 650T was calibrated weekly. His incident reports were models of clarity that newer rangers studied during training. The morning Tyler Brennan's parents reported him missing, John was reviewing meteorological data at the Apgar Ranger Station, noting the unusual temperature drops recorded over the past 72 hours. October in Glacier National Park typically brought cold, but the thermometer had plummeted 15 degrees below seasonal averages. Nothing the Weather Service could explain, just an anomalous cold front that seemed to settle specifically over the northern quadrant of the park. "John?" Sarah Chen, the station supervisor, appeared in his doorway. Her normally composed face carried tension around the eyes. "We've got a situation. 23-year-old male, failed to check in from a solo backpacking trip. Parents drove up from Kalispell when he missed his scheduled call yesterday evening." John saved his weather analysis and pulled up a fresh incident form on his desktop. "When did he start his hike?" 4 days ago. Planned route was the Highline Trail to Granite Park Chalet, then north toward 50 Mountain. 7-day trip total. John's mind immediately began calculating. The Highline was one of the park's most popular trails, relatively safe, well-maintained, excellent sight lines. He file an itinerary? Detailed one. Kid's a grad student in biology, very organized. Sarah handed him a printed copy, and John appreciated the neat handwriting, the specific waypoints, the realistic daily mileage estimates. Tyler Brennan understood wilderness travel, which made his silence more concerning. "Weather's been clear until yesterday," John said, scanning the route. "No major snowfall, no avalanche danger in that sector. He carrying a PLB? Garmin in reach. Parents tried pinging it this morning. No response. Either the battery's dead or something else." John didn't believe in something else. In his experience, missing hikers meant injury, disorientation, or equipment failure. The human body was fragile. The wilderness was indifferent. Between those two facts lay every backcountry tragedy. "I'll take Peterson and Garcia. We can be on the trail in 40 minutes. Sarah nodded, but something in her expression made John pause. "What?" "That's the third incident in this area in 6 weeks. We found the first 2. Exposure death and a broken femur, but the circumstances were..." She chose her words carefully. "Unusual." John waited. Sarah wasn't given to drama. Both hikers were found off-trail, miles off-trail, experienced backpackers who somehow left marked paths and wandered into difficult terrain. The exposure death, Mark Sutherland, 56, 20 years of mountaineering experience. We found him walking in circles at 11,000 feet. No coat, no pack. He'd stripped down to his thermal layer in 20-degree weather. Paradoxical undressing. John knew the phenomenon. Severe hypothermia could trigger a sensation of burning heat, causing victims to remove clothing. And the femur break? Janet Morrison fell into a ravine we can't figure out how she reached. Her journal. Sarah pulled out her phone, scrolled to a photo of handwritten text. Last entry says she heard someone calling her name, followed the voice into the forest. John studied the writing. Neat at first, then increasingly erratic. The final words were barely legible. "So hungry, please God, so hungry." "Hypothermia causes confusion," John said, though something about the phrasing disturbed him. Disorientation, poor judgment, hallucinations. That's what I wrote in my report. Sarah's tone suggested she hadn't entirely convinced herself. "Just be careful up there. Radio in every 2 hours." John assembled his pack with mechanical precision. Motorola CP200D radio, extra batteries, first aid kit, emergency bivvy, 3 days of supplies. His wilderness EMT certification was current. His GPS had Tyler's planned route loaded. Everything proceeding according to protocol. Peterson and Garcia met him at the trailhead, Both experienced backcountry rangers who'd worked dozens of search and rescue operations. They divided the route into segments, established radio schedules, reviewed emergency procedures. By 10:47 a.m., they were hiking north on the Highline Trail, beneath a sky the color of old bruises. The trail followed the Continental Divide, offering spectacular views of glacial valleys and sawtooth peaks. In summer, this path crawled with tourists. Now, in mid-October, with most facilities closed, they encountered no one. Their boots crunched on frost-stiffened grass. Their breath formed clouds that hung in the windless air. John checked his thermometer. 31 degrees, normal for the elevation and season. Yet he found himself zipping his jacket higher, pulling his glove cuffs over his wrists. Cold as hell, Peterson muttered, echoing John's thoughts. They reached Granite Park Chalet by 2:15 p.m., an historic stone backcountry shelter, now shuttered for winter. According to Tyler's itinerary, he'd stayed here 3 nights ago. John tried the door, found it locked as expected. No signs of forced entry. No indication anyone had been here recently. "Tyler!" Garcia's voice echoed across empty meadows. "Tyler Brennan!" Silence. Not even birds. John noticed that suddenly. The absence of wildlife sounds. No marmot whistles, no Clark's nutcracker calls. The forest had gone quiet. "Split up," John said. "Garcia, check the campsites east of the chalet. Peterson, take the western trails. I'll search the structures. Reconvene here in 1 hour." They dispersed. John circled the chalet, examining the ground for tracks, disturbed vegetation, anything anomalous. Behind the building, near the stone foundation, he found something. Scratch marks. Deep gouges in the wooden door frame, about 7 feet high. 3 parallel lines, evenly spaced. Fresh. He could see pale wood beneath the damaged surface. Bear, his rational mind supplied. Black bear testing the door. But the spacing was wrong. Bear claws would be closer together, and the angle suggested something standing upright, reaching up rather than rearing. John photographed the marks with his iPhone, made notes in his incident log. Probably nothing. Probably. He continued his search, finding nothing else unusual until he reached the northeast corner of the building. There, pressed into a patch of remaining snow, was a boot print. Men's size 10 or 11. Recent. The edges were still sharp. Tyler wore size 10 according to his parents' description. John's pulse quickened despite himself. He photographed the print, took GPS coordinates, 487923 to Guienne, 1137156 to W. The print pointed north toward 50 Mountain, away from the trail. His radio crackled. "John, it's Garcia. Got something weird here." "Copy. What is it?" "Static, then. There's a campsite. Tent still up, but it's shredded. I mean, completely shredded. And there's food scattered everywhere, but nothing ate it." John felt something cold settle in his stomach. Something that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Mark the location. Don't touch anything. I'm coming to you." He found Garcia standing 10 yards from what had once been a quality backpacking tent. Now it hung in tatters from its frame, the rainfly ripped into ribbons, the mesh walls torn open in long, parallel gashes. A bear canister lay on its side nearby, unopened. Freeze-dried meals were strewn across the clearing, untouched, still in their packages. "What kind of animal tears up a tent but doesn't eat the food?" Garcia asked. "The kind that's hunting something other than calories." John didn't say it aloud. Instead, he knelt beside the tent, examining the damage. The tears were methodical, almost surgical. Not the random destruction of a hungry bear, but something searching. Inside the tent's remains, he found a sleeping bag, also shredded, a journal, pages scattered, and a Garmin in reach, Tyler's emergency beacon, crushed as if something had stepped on it. John picked up one of the journal pages. Tyler's handwriting dated 3 days ago, 3rd night at Granite Park. Incredible isolation. Haven't seen another person since the Highline. Strange how quiet it is up here. Sarah warned me about bears, but I haven't seen any wildlife at all. Not even ravens. Weird thing. I keep feeling like I'm being watched. Probably just my imagination acting up in the solitude. Also incredibly hungry, even though I've been eating my regular calories. Can't seem to get full. Another page dated 2 days ago. The handwriting shakier. Something wrong. Temperature dropped hard last night. Woke up freezing even in my 15-degree bag. Thought I heard someone outside the tent, calling my name. But when I looked, nothing there. Hunger worse. Ate 2 days of food yesterday. Still not enough. What is wrong with me? The final entry, barely legible. It knows my name. It's been following me. I can hear it breathing in the dark. So hungry. God, I'm so hungry I could eat my own. The sentence ended there, the pen trailing off into an illegible scrawl. John's hands were shaking as he photographed the pages, not from cold. John forced himself to think systematically, to process what he was seeing through the framework of wilderness medicine and search protocol. Tyler was suffering from something. Hypothermia could cause paranoia, hallucinations. Altitude sickness could trigger psychological symptoms. Giardia or other waterborne illness could explain the hunger, the weakness. There were rational explanations. There had to be. Garcia, what's your read on the timeline here? Garcia crouched beside the tent, studying the damage. Tent's been like this at least 24 hours, maybe longer. Dew pattern suggests the tears happened before last night. So Tyler either left here on foot or something. John stopped. Something what? Something took him? He was thinking like a civilian, letting imagination override analysis. Peterson's voice crackled over the radio. John, you need to see this. I'm about a quarter-mile north of the chalet, following what looks like a track. Be there in 5. They found Peterson standing at the edge of a game trail that wound into dense forest. He pointed at the ground without speaking. Boot prints. Tyler's distinctive tread pattern, confirmed against the photograph John had taken earlier. But the prints were wrong. The stride length was too long, nearly 6 feet between steps. And they were deep, far deeper than a 170-pound man should leave, even on soft ground. He was running, Garcia said. But the prints didn't show the typical heel strike of running. They were flat, as if Tyler had been moving on his toes, or as if something had been carrying him. John pushed the thought away. We follow the trail. Standard spacing, 15 feet between us. Watch for what? Peterson's question hung in the air. John didn't have an answer that made sense. They moved into the forest, following the boot prints north. The trees closed in overhead, ancient subalpine firs and white-bark pines that filtered the afternoon light into a gray-green gloom. The temperature dropped further. John's thermometer read 28 degrees, though they'd descended in elevation. The boot prints continued for half a mile, then stopped abruptly at a small clearing. In the center of the clearing, someone had arranged dozens of pine branches into a rough circle, about 15 feet in diameter. Inside the circle, more branches stood upright and interwoven to create a dome-like structure, a crude shelter. But the construction was bizarre. The branches were stripped of bark, leaving them bone white, and they'd been arranged in patterns, geometric shapes that hurt John's eyes to follow, angles that seemed to shift when he looked at them directly. Did Tyler build this? Garcia whispered. John stepped closer, noting details that made his skin prickle despite his attempts at rational analysis. The branches had been broken, not cut, snapped with enormous force based on the splintering. Some were 10 feet long, 4 inches thick, far too heavy for a man to move easily. And there was something else. Symbols carved into some of the branches. Not English, not any alphabet John recognized. The cuts were fresh, sap still beating from the wounds in the wood. Tyler's not here, Peterson said. So where? A sound cut him off, distant but distinct, a voice calling from deeper in the forest. Help! Please! I need help! All 3 rangers froze. John's training screamed at him to respond, to move toward the voice, to render aid. But something else, Some primitive part of his brain that existed before training, before civilization, told him to run. "That's him," Garcia said. "That's got to be Tyler." The voice came again, clearer now. "Please, someone, I'm hurt." John pulled out his radio with hands he forced to steadiness. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Pritchard. We've located what we believe is Tyler Brennan. Subject is calling for help, but not visible. Requesting." Static erupted from the radio so loud John nearly dropped it. Through the interference he thought he heard something else, a wet, clicking sound like teeth on bone. Then silence. "Radios are dead," Peterson said, checking his own unit. "All channels." The voice called again. "Help me. God, please, it hurts so much." But this time John heard something wrong with it. The pitch was too steady, the words too clear for someone in genuine distress. It was like a recording, a perfect reproduction of human speech without the variation of real pain. "That's not Tyler," John said quietly. "What?" Garcia stared at him. "John, someone's hurt out there. We have to listen to it. Really listen." They fell silent. The voice came again. "Please, someone, I'm hurt." Exactly the same words, exactly the same intonation. A loop, a lure. "Jesus Christ," Peterson breathed. "What is that?" The question John couldn't answer. Wouldn't let himself answer because the answer waiting in the back of his mind, in the place where his grandmother's old stories lived, before college and ranger training had buried them. That answer was impossible. "We're leaving," John said. "Now. Back to the trail, back to the station. We need backup, we need..." Movement in his peripheral vision. Something pale between the trees about 50 yards out. John turned, bringing up his flashlight even though it was still afternoon. Nothing there, just trees and shadow. But the temperature had dropped again. His breath wasn't just visible now. It crystallized in the air, falling like snow. "John," Garcia's voice was tight. "There." John followed his pointing finger. On the far side of the clearing, partially obscured by undergrowth, was a shape. Man-sized, not moving. They approached slowly, John's mind cataloging symptoms. Unconscious victim, possible hypothermia, probable trauma. His training created a buffer against the fear trying to claw its way up his throat. But when they reached the shape, training failed him. It wasn't Tyler. It was what remained of a mule deer, a full-grown buck that might have weighed 200 pounds. But it had been opened. Ribcage spread like wings, organs gone, bones scraped clean. The skull was crushed, as if something had bitten through it to reach the brain. And the kill was fresh. Blood still dripped from the carcass, steaming in the cold air. "No bear did this," Peterson said. His voice held the careful control of someone trying very hard not to panic. "No bear, no wolf, no mountain lion. This is..." A branch snapped behind them. All three rangers spun, flashlights converging on the sound. Nothing. Just forest. Just trees. Except the trees were wrong. John's rational mind struggled to process what his eyes reported. The spacing between trunks wasn't consistent. What had been 10 feet of clearance was now 5. The forest was closer than it had been, or something was using the forest as camouflage. "Back to back," John said, slowly toward the trail. "Don't run." They moved as a unit, John's mind racing through protocols that didn't exist, procedures for situations that weren't supposed to happen. His hand found the bear spray on his belt, 20 ounces of capsaicin that would stop a grizzly at 30 feet. But what if you weren't facing a bear? The voice came again, and this time it was closer. "Please, someone, I'm hurt." Followed by another voice, this one Peterson's. "We're leaving. Now. Back to the trail." John's blood turned to ice. Those were Peterson's exact words from minutes ago, repeated with perfect accuracy. "It's learning our voices," Garcia whispered. They reached the game trail, started moving faster. John kept glancing back, seeing nothing but knowing something was following. He could feel it. The pressure of its attention, the weight of its gaze. His grandmother's stories surfaced despite his attempts to drown them in rationality. Stories told in Ojibwe during long winters in Minnesota, before she'd sent him to college, before he'd learned to dismiss such things as folklore. Wendigo, the hunger that walks, the spirit that makes you its home. No, absolutely not. There were no Wendigo. There were hypothermia victims and sick animals and the human mind's tendency to see patterns, threats, monsters in ordinary phenomena. But the cold was wrong. The silence was wrong. The forest itself felt wrong. They emerged onto the Highline Trail as the sun touched the western peaks. Full dark was perhaps 90 minutes away. "We need to move," John said. 4 miles to the trailhead. Double time. They started jogging, packs bouncing. John's mind was already composing the report he'd have to write, trying to find language that would explain without sounding insane. They'd found evidence of Tyler, found signs of something. They'd need to return with a full search team, armed personnel, maybe wildlife services. Behind them, back in the forest, something screamed. It started as Tyler's voice. "Help me!" But then twisted, spiraling up into a shriek of such inhuman hunger that John's legs went weak. The sound went on, echoing off the peaks, filling the valley. Then it stopped. In the silence that followed, John heard something else. Footsteps on the trail behind them. Not running. Walking. Heavy and deliberate. Coming closer. They ran. Training said don't run from predators. Never run. Running triggers pursuit. But every instinct John possessed was screaming at him to move, to flee, to put distance between himself and whatever was behind them. The Highline Trail became a blur of stone and grass. John's lungs burned in the thin mountain air. His pack slammed against his spine with each stride. Garcia and Peterson flanked him, all 3 rangers pushing beyond sustainable pace, beyond safety protocols, beyond everything except the primitive need to escape. The footsteps behind them never changed rhythm. Always the same measured pace. Always the same distance back, close enough that John could hear each impact on the trail. He risked a glance over his shoulder. Nothing. Empty trail. But those footsteps kept coming. "John!" Peterson gasped. "I can't. My heart." Peterson collapsed. Not dramatically, just a sudden loss of leg function that sent him sprawling across the trail. Garcia and John skidded to a stop, John's training overriding fear. Patient down, possible cardiac event. Protocol dictated immediate assessment. He dropped beside Peterson, pressing fingers to his throat. Pulse thready and rapid, skin cold and clammy. Not cardiac, shock probably, combined with exertion and... The footsteps stopped. John's head snapped up. The trail behind them was empty in the failing light. Nothing but rock and scattered snow. But the silence was worse than the sound had been, because silence meant ambush, meant... "Get him up," John said. "Garcia, support his left side. Move." They hauled Peterson upright, his arms over their shoulders. Ahead, the trail wound along a cliff face, garden wall, a section where the path was carved into sheer rock, with a 1,000-foot drop on one side and vertical stone on the other. No choice. They started forward, Peterson's boots dragging. "Leave me," Peterson mumbled. "Go. Get help." "Shut up," Garcia said. "We're not leaving you." They reached garden wall as darkness fell completely. John pulled out his headlamp with one hand, the beam illuminating maybe 30 feet of trail. The drop to his right was invisible now, just emptiness and cold air rising from the depths. Something moved on the cliff face above them. John froze, craning his neck upward. His light caught bare rock, scattered vegetation, and a face, bone white, elongated, jaw distended in a way that shouldn't be possible, lined with too many teeth. Eyes that reflected John's flashlight like a deer's, but wrong, the pupils vertical and predatory. It smiled at him, then it was gone, scrambling up the cliff with inhuman speed, pale limbs too long and jointed wrong. John heard clicking sounds, claws on stone. "Did you see that?" His voice came out as a whisper. "Garcia, tell me you saw that." "I saw it." Garcia's face had gone gray. "John, what is that thing?" John's grandmother's voice echoed in memory. "The Wendigo can't be killed. Once it marks you, once it knows your name, you belong to it. The hunger becomes yours, and then you become the hunger." "It's not possible," John said. He said it 3 times like an incantation. "It's not possible." Above them, something laughed. The sound was Tyler's voice, Tyler's laugh, but stretched and warped into something that scraped against John's sanity. "Almost there," John lied. They were still 2 miles from the trailhead. 2 miles of darkness and narrow trail, and that thing circling above them. They kept moving. Peterson's condition was deteriorating, shock deepening, consciousness fading. He needed warmth, hydration, medical care. He needed things John couldn't provide out here. The trail widened slightly as they left Garden Wall. Trees closed in on both sides, lodgepole pines that formed a tunnel of darkness their lights barely penetrated. John's analytical mind noticed details despite his fear. The temperature had dropped below 20 degrees now. Frost was forming on their packs, their clothing. Their breath created clouds so thick it was hard to see through them. This cold wasn't natural. Couldn't be natural. The temperature had fallen 40 degrees in less than 6 hours. "John." Garcia's voice was small. "The trees. Look at the trees." John looked. Symbols. The same symbols they'd seen carved into the branches back at that impossible shelter. But these weren't carved. They were formed by the way branches grew, by the pattern of bark, by frost that somehow wrote geometry into the wood. And they were everywhere. Every tree they passed carried the marks. "We're in its territory," John said. The words came from some distant, detached part of himself, the part that had already accepted impossible things, that had stopped fighting. "We've been in its territory since the chalet." "That's insane," Garcia said. But he didn't sound convinced. They rounded a bend and John's light caught something on the trail ahead, a backpack. Good quality, Osprey brand, partially shredded. Tyler's backpack. John recognized it from the description his parents had provided, but if the pack was here, 2 miles from where they'd found the campsite. "Tyler walked this far," Garcia said. "Maybe he made it out. Maybe he's already safe." No. John knew better. The pack wasn't dropped in flight, it was placed, carefully positioned in the center of the trail where they'd have to see it. Another lure. "Don't touch it," John said. "Keep moving." But Peterson had gone completely limp, dead weight between them. They couldn't carry him any farther. Not at speed, not in the dark. John made a decision he knew he'd regret, if he survived long enough to regret anything. "Garcia, we need to stop. Set up an emergency shelter. Get Peterson stabilized. Wait for dawn. I'll radio." "Radios don't work, remember?" "Then we wait. My PLB will ping our location. Search and rescue will come at first light." Garcia stared at him. "You want to camp? Here, with that thing out there. If we keep moving in this condition, we'll fall off the trail. Or Peterson will die. Or both." John was already pulling his emergency bivvy from his pack. "We pick a defensible spot, build a fire, take turns on watch. Standard protocol." The fact that he was applying standard protocol to a non-standard situation, to a situation that shattered every assumption his worldview was built on, didn't escape him. But protocol was all he had left. Without it, there was only panic. They found a small clearing 20 yards off the trail, backed by a rock face that would prevent approach from behind. John started gathering wood while Garcia tended to Peterson, checking vitals, wrapping him in a sleeping bag. The forest was utterly silent, except for their own movements. No wind, no animal sounds, just the creak of branches and the crunch of frozen snow under John's boots. He was building the fire when Garcia said, very quietly, "John, don't move. Don't react. But there's something behind the tree line. 30 feet out, 10 o'clock position." John forced himself to continue stacking kindling, to not look, to appear unaware. His peripheral vision caught pale movement, something circling their position. How long has it been there? Since we stopped watching. John's hands shook as he pulled out his lighter. The flame seemed pathetically small, absurdly insufficient against the weight of darkness pressing in around them. But fire was fire, the most ancient protection, the barrier between civilization and wilderness. The kindling caught. Flames spread to larger wood. Heat and light pushed back the night in a small bubble. On the far side of the firelight, just at the edge of visibility, something moved. It was Tyler. John recognized his face from the photos his parents had provided. Lean features, strong jaw, dark hair. He was standing in the trees, completely naked despite the freezing temperature, watching them. "Tyler?" Garcia called out. "Tyler Brennan? We're park rangers. We're here to help you." Tyler smiled. "Help? Yes, I need help. I'm so hungry." But his lips didn't move when he spoke. The voice came from his throat, from inside his throat, but his mouth stayed closed, stretched in that unnatural smile. John grabbed Garcia's arm. "That's not Tyler." "What do you—" Tyler took a step closer, then another. Joints bending wrong, knees folding backward, spine arching impossibly. His smile widened, jaw unhinging like a snake's. "I'm so hungry," he said again. "Please help me. I need to eat. I need to eat." The last word wasn't Tyler's voice anymore. It was that clicking, chittering sound they'd heard on the radio, but forced through human vocal cords. The sound of something imitating humanity without understanding it. "Don't look at it," John said. He pulled out his bear spray, popped the safety tab. "Garcia, wake up Peterson, now." "I can't wake him. He's not responding. Hypothermia, full body shutdown. They needed to evacuate him immediately, needed a helicopter, needed—" Tyler, the thing wearing Tyler, lunged. It moved with horrifying speed, crossing 30 feet in a single bound. John emptied his bear spray directly into its face. The capsaicin cloud should have stopped a grizzly. It didn't even slow down. John felt hands, if they could be called hands, things with too many fingers and joints in wrong places, close around his throat. Felt himself lifted off his feet. Smelled rot and copper and something worse. Something like the inside of an abattoir. The thing's face was inches from his. This close, he could see that it wasn't wearing Tyler's body. It was consuming it from the inside, stretching the skin like a suit, using the flesh as camouflage while something ancient and endlessly hungry looked out through Tyler's eyes. "You know what I am," it whispered. Tyler's voice. John's voice. Garcia's voice. All of them at once. "Your grandmother told you stories. You stopped believing, but belief isn't required. Only flesh." John's vision grayed. His lungs screamed for air. His hands scrabbled uselessly at those wrong-jointed fingers. Then heat. Searing heat. Garcia had grabbed a burning branch from the fire and thrust it into the creature's face. The thing shrieked. That terrible ascending shriek. And dropped John. It scrambled back into the forest, Tyler's body moving like a puppet with tangled strings. John collapsed beside the fire, gasping, his throat bruised but intact. Garcia stood over him with the burning branch held high, his face reflecting orange flames and absolute terror. "What?" Garcia's voice broke. "What was that, John? What the fuck was that?" John forced himself to his feet. His carefully constructed rationality had shattered. There were no protocols for this, no training, no logical framework. There was only the truth his grandmother had tried to give him. The truth he'd dismissed as superstition. "Wendigo," he said. The word felt strange in his mouth, like admitting belief in something he'd spent his adult life denying. "It's a Wendigo, spirit of hunger and winter. In the old stories, it possesses people, makes them cannibalize others, makes them monsters." "That's a myth. You just saw it." Garcia had no response. In the forest around them, they heard movement. Not just one thing now. Multiple sources. Circling. And with each passing moment, the cold deepened. Frost climbed up their boots, coated their clothes. The fire struggled against air that had gone beyond winter, into something primordial. Peterson stirred. His eyes opened, but they weren't his eyes anymore. "I'm so hungry," Peterson said. He sat up with mechanical precision, bones cracking. "We should eat Garcia. He has more meat." John grabbed Garcia and ran. Behind them, Peterson, what Peterson had become, laughed with a sound like snapping bones. The fire died instantly, plunging the forest into absolute darkness. John's headlamp battery was draining fast, the beam flickering despite being fully charged that morning. They crashed through underbrush, no longer following any trail. John's GPS was useless. The screen showed static, then symbols he didn't recognize, then nothing. His sense of direction dissolved. The forest had become a maze designed by something that didn't think in human terms. "We're going to die out here," Garcia panted. Maybe. Probably. But John's mind was working again, processing the situation through a new framework. Not ranger protocols, his grandmother's stories. Fire hurts it. It fears fire. It hunts those who are alone, cut off from community. It speaks your language but doesn't understand your words. It mimics but cannot create. Once it marks you, you have one defense: dawn. The Wendigo is a creature of winter and night. Sunrise weakens it. How long until dawn? John checked his watch. 2:47 a.m. 4 hours. Maybe less. They just had to survive 4 hours. "Garcia, we need to find shelter, somewhere we can defend until dawn." "There's nothing out here. We're in the middle of..." Garcia's words cut off, not because he stopped talking, but because the sound simply ceased to carry. John could see his mouth moving, but heard nothing. Then he realized he couldn't hear his own breathing, couldn't hear his footsteps. The forest had gone completely, impossibly silent. John grabbed Garcia's shoulder, pointed ahead. Through the trees, light. Faint and flickering, but definitely light. They ran toward it, emerging into a clearing John recognized, the stone shelter they'd found earlier. The circle of white branches, the dome structure. But now it was different. Someone had lit a fire inside the dome. And sitting beside that fire, wrapped in a tattered sleeping bag, was Tyler Brennan. The real Tyler. John could tell immediately. The fear in his eyes was genuine. The trembling in his hands authentic. This wasn't the puppet they'd encountered before. "Please," Tyler croaked. His voice was barely audible. "Please, you have to help me. It's inside me. I can feel it inside me." John approached slowly. Professional assessment overriding horror. Severe dehydration, stage 3 hypothermia, probable frostbite on extremities, multiple lacerations, psychological trauma. "Tyler, my name is John Pritchard. I'm a park ranger. How long have you been here?" "I don't know. Days? It keeps making me walk, making me do things. I tried to fight it, but I'm so hungry. God, I'm so hungry, and it says if I just eat, I can stop being hungry. But I know what it wants me to eat, and I won't." Tyler's voice rose to a scream. Then he convulsed, his back arching impossibly. When he looked at them again, his eyes were wrong. Pupils too wide, too dark, infinite hunger staring out from human sockets. "You shouldn't have come," Tyler said. But it was the thing's voice now. That clicking, chittering forced through vocal cords. "Now we're all so hungry." The branches forming the dome began to move. Not swaying in wind. There was no wind. Moving deliberately, weaving tighter, cutting off escape routes. John understood. The shelter wasn't protection. It was a trap. Garcia saw it too. "Run!" They bolted for the gap in the branches, but the structure constricted like a muscle, like a throat swallowing. John felt branches tear at his clothes, his skin. Garcia screamed. Then they were through, stumbling into the forest beyond. John looked back once. Tyler's face visible through gaps in the branches, mouthing words John couldn't hear but understood. "Kill me." They ran. The forest had become something else now, a living thing, aware and hostile. Trees moved in ways trees shouldn't move. The ground shifted underfoot. Directions lost meaning. East could be west, could be north, could be down. John's mind fractured under the impossibility. This wasn't hypothermia-induced hallucination. This was real. The world was stranger and more terrible than any rational framework could contain. Garcia grabbed his arm, pointing. Through the trees. Lights. Multiple lights moving in formation. A search party. Rescue. They ran toward the lights, shouting. John's voice worked again suddenly, sound returning to the forest. Here! We're here! Help! The lights converged. Headlamps. Flashlights. 6 rangers in cold weather gear, Sarah Chen at the lead. John! Sarah's voice was relief and anger mixed. Where the hell have you been? You missed 3 check-ins. We've been searching for... She stopped, seeing their condition. Blood and tears in their clothing. The absolute terror in their eyes. Something's out here, John said. His voice sounded distant, disconnected. Something's wrong with Peterson. And Tyler Brennan, he's possessed or infected or... Sarah's hand on his shoulder. Firm, grounding. Slow down. Deep breaths. You're in shock. No, you don't understand. There's a Wendigo. I know how that sounds. I know it's impossible, but... One of the other rangers laughed. Not cruel, just reflexive. The laugh of someone hearing something absurd. Wendigo? John, have you been drinking the glacier melt? John grabbed Sarah's jacket, desperate to make her understand. Check the reports, Mark Sutherland, Janet Morrison. They encountered it too. It marks people, makes them hungry, makes them... A scream from the forest. Everyone froze. The scream came again. Peterson's voice, but wrong, stretched, like someone pulling a recording to breaking point. That's Peterson, Garcia said. His face was sheet white. That's what he became. The search party rangers looked at each other. They thought it was an animal. John could see it in their faces. They thought this was a normal rescue that had gotten complicated by wildlife. They had no idea. Everyone back to back, Sarah ordered. Weapons out. Garcia, what are we dealing with? Something that used to be human, Garcia said. Something that... The forest exploded into motion. Peterson burst from the tree line, but Peterson transformed. His spine had elongated, doubling his height. His jaw hung unhinged, teeth multiplied into rows. His fingers ended in bone spurs that had burst through the skin. He moved on all fours, but wrong. Each limb bending in multiple places, carrying him across the clearing in a scuttling rush that made John's mind reject what his eyes reported. The search party opened fire. John wasn't aware anyone carried firearms, but apparently someone did. The shots were deafening in the night silence. He saw rounds impact Peterson's body, saw flesh tear and blood spray. Peterson, the thing that had been Peterson, didn't slow down. It fell on one of the rangers John didn't see who didn't want to see, and there were sounds John knew he'd hear in nightmares for the rest of his life, however short that life might be. Run! Sarah screamed. They ran. The whole group abandoning formation, abandoning protocol, abandoning the fallen ranger. Pure flight. But they were running blind, flashlights bouncing, and the forest was working against them. Branches grabbed, roots moved. The ground tilted. One by one, the group scattered. John lost sight of Garcia, Sarah, the others. He was alone in darkness and cold and hunger. The hunger was in him now. He could feel it, gnawing at his insides with teeth made of winter and rage. His grandmother's stories had never mentioned this part, that the Wendigo didn't just kill you. It made you part of itself. It shared its eternal hunger, until you were so desperate to make it stop that you'd do anything, eat anything, become anything. John's hands were changing. He could see bones pressing against skin from inside, trying to break through. His jaw ached, hinging wider than it should. No. He pulled his emergency beacon from his pocket, the PLB that should have been pinging since yesterday, calling for rescue that never came because the thing had somehow blocked the signal. But there was one final use for technology. John's lighter, his emergency fire starter, the waterproof matches in his pack. He dumped accelerant, alcohol-based hand sanitizer across himself, soaking his jacket, his pants. poured it over his changing hands. Fire hurts it. If he was becoming it, then fire would hurt him too. Dawn was close. He could feel it, some instinct that predated his humanity. The eastern sky was lightening just barely, gray-pink against black. John struck the match. The Rangers found him at 6:47 a.m., curled beside the smoldering remains of his clothes, skin blistered and raw but alive. The cold snap had broken with sunrise. Temperature had risen 30 degrees in less than an hour. They found Garcia 200 yards away, unconscious but breathing. Severe hypothermia, psychological trauma, but alive. They found Peterson's body a quarter-mile north. Medical examiner would rule it animal attack, severe trauma consistent with bear predation. The fact that Peterson's bear spray hadn't been deployed would be noted as evidence of how quickly the attack occurred. They never found Tyler Brennan. Search continued for 3 weeks before being called off. Eventually, he'd be listed as one of Glacier National Park's unsolved disappearances, another name in a growing list of people who walked into the wilderness and never returned. John spent 4 weeks in the burn unit in Kalispell. Second-degree burns over 30% of his body. But the doctors said he was lucky, another minute, and he would have died from exposure. They asked why he'd set himself on fire. John told them he'd thought he was experiencing severe hypothermia-induced psychosis, had been trying to warm himself, had made a mistake with the accelerant. The official report concluded that Rangers Pritchard and Garcia had suffered psychological breaks under extreme stress, exacerbated by hypothermia and isolation. Peterson had died in an animal attack while the group was separated. Tyler Brennan had likely succumbed to exposure elsewhere in the park. Clean, rational, explainable. John read the report from his hospital bed and said nothing. Sarah Chen visited once, 2 days before his discharge. She sat in the uncomfortable chair beside his bed, not quite looking at him. The other incidents, she said quietly. Sutherland and Morrison. I went back through the files. There have been 11 similar cases in the past 5 years. All in that section of the park, all during cold snaps. You're telling me this why? Because I'm recommending that section be closed indefinitely. Geological instability, risk of avalanche. Some bureaucratic excuse that'll keep people away. John studied her face. You believe me. I believe something happened out there that doesn't fit in my report. I believe you and Garcia saw something that broke you both in ways I can't explain. She stood. I also believe some things shouldn't be explained. Some doors shouldn't be opened. She left without another word. Garcia visited later that day. He looked hollow, 30 pounds lighter, hair going gray at the temples though he was only 32. They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Garcia said, I keep dreaming about it. The hunger. In my dreams, I give in. I eat. In mine, too, John admitted. What was it? Really? John thought about his grandmother, about stories told in a dying language about things that existed before names, before categories, before human beings tried to organize the world into boxes labeled real and not real. Something old, he said. Something that remembers when we were prey. Is it still out there? John touched his bandaged hands, feeling the new skin growing beneath, pink and raw, feeling the echo of change that had begun, the widening of his jaw, the lengthening of his bones, before fire had burned it away. Yes, he said, it's still out there, and it's always hungry. 6 months later, John resigned from the Park Service. He moved back to Minnesota, to the reservation where his grandmother had lived before she died. He learned the language she'd tried to teach him, learned the stories he dismissed. Some nights when winter pressed close and the wind howled in the pines, he felt the hunger stir. Just an echo, just a shadow of that infinite want. But enough to remind him, enough to keep him vigilant, because the thing his grandmother had told him, the thing he'd finally learned to believe, the Wendigo wasn't just out there, it was in here too, in the cold places of the human heart, in the hunger that could never be satisfied, in the voice that said, take, consume, devour. and the only defense was to stay human, to stay warm, to stay connected, to never ever go into the cold alone. Garcia called sometimes. Neither of them mentioned what happened. They talked about weather, sports, meaningless things. But John understood what the calls really meant. I'm still human. Are you still human? Please tell me we're still human. And John would answer, I'm still here. Which wasn't quite the same thing, but it was the best either of them could offer. The Wendigo walked in Glacier National Park still. It walked in every dark forest, every winter night, every moment of desperate hunger. It was walking now. It would walk forever. And it was always, always hunting. Great Smoky Mountains National Park, Tennessee. October 2008. Daniel Torres had learned to recognize the weight of silence. Not the comfortable quiet of a forest at rest, but the particular heaviness that settled over the Smokies when something had gone wrong. He'd felt it 18 months ago, standing over the remains they'd found near Klingman's Dome. What little the mountain had returned. He felt it now, watching the fog roll between the peaks like something alive, and searching. The ranger station at Cades Cove smelled of burnt coffee and old paper. Daniel sat at his desk, methodically updating the incident log with details that wouldn't capture what mattered. Melissa Hartwell, 27, solo backpacker. Last contact 6 days ago at Spence Field Shelter. Experienced hiker, proper equipment, no history of recklessness. The words meant nothing. They never did. His Motorola radio crackled with static. Atmospheric interference from the approaching weather system according to the morning briefing. Daniel had stopped believing in coincidences that convenient. Torres, you copy? Chief Ranger Bill Hendricks's voice cut through the white noise. Copy, Bill. SR teams assembling at 0700 tomorrow. Weather windows closing fast. Your point on the ground search. Daniel's hand tightened around the radio. Point. Always point. Because he was thorough, they said. Because he understood the mountain, because after Sarah Chen... He cut the thought off with practiced efficiency. Understood. I'll prep tonight. Daniel. Bill's voice softened, which was worse. You don't have to take this one. I'm fine. That's not what I asked. Daniel looked at the wall where his certificates hung beside the framed photograph he should have removed. The old team, before. Sarah's smile was frozen in that moment, unaware that 3 weeks later she'd be another name in the incident log. Equipment failure, the report had concluded. Tragic accident, words that meant nothing. I'll be ready at 0700, he said, and ended the transmission before Bill could press further. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of rust and shadow. Daniel spread Melissa's file across his desk. The photograph clipped to the front showed a woman with dark hair pulled back, eyes sharp with intelligence. Her itinerary was meticulous. Daily check-ins, precise coordinates, backup plans. Someone who understood the wilderness. Someone like Sarah had been. Daniel pushed the comparison away and focused on the map. Melissa's last confirmed position was Spence Field, elevation 4,120 feet. From there, she'd planned to take the Appalachian Trail north toward Rocky Top, 12 miles of exposed ridgeline before dropping into Thunderhead. Standard route, nothing unusual, except she'd never reached the next shelter. His hand moved to the evidence bag containing Melissa's personal locator beacon, found 2 days ago by day hikers, shattered at the base of a ravine 3 miles off her planned route. The GPS unit inside was destroyed, but not from impact. Something had torn into it with enough force to scatter the internal components across 20 feet of rocky ground. The radio on his desk burst to life with a shriek of feedback that made Daniel flinch. Static washed over the speaker in waves, punctuated by fragments of something that might have been breathing. He reached for the volume knob, but the sound cut out before he could touch it. Then came the voice. Anyone, hear me. Please. Daniel froze. The transmission was broken, drowning in interference, but unmistakably human. Unmistakably terrified. It's not dead. God, it's not dead. This is Ranger Torres. Identify yourself. Daniel grabbed the radio, his training overriding the ice forming in his chest. Found her. Cemetery, old settlement, she's still here. Who is this? What's your location? The voice dissolved into static, laced with something else. A wet, rasping sound that didn't belong to any atmospheric phenomenon Daniel knew. When the words came again, they were barely whispers threaded through the white noise. Mouthful of dirt. She smiled at me, smiled with dirt in her teeth. Give me coordinates. Daniel was on his feet now, checking the radio's display. No channel indicator, no signal strength reading. The transmission shouldn't have been reaching him at all. Tell Daniel. The voice sharpened for just a moment, crystal clear. Tell him Sarah says hello. The radio went dead. Daniel stared at the silent device, his pulse hammering against his ribs. The voice had been female. Young. Melissa's age. And that last part. No one here knew about Sarah except Bill. No one mentioned her name. He'd made sure of that. His hands were shaking as he replayed the last 18 months in his mind. The investigation, the counseling sessions he'd attended mechanically, saying what they needed to hear. The transfer request he'd submitted and withdrawn. The nights he'd spent hiking the same trail where they'd found her equipment, looking for something the official report had missed. The radio crackled once more, a single sound that might have been laughter or sobbing, then silence. Daniel grabbed his Garmin GPS, his pack, his service weapon. The logical part of his brain, the part that had kept him functional since Sarah, cataloged his actions clinically. Unauthorized solo search, inadequate preparation, dangerous weather conditions, every regulation he was violating. But the voice had known Sarah's name, and something in those static drowned words had carried the texture of truth. The trail to Spence Field was a dark throat swallowing Daniel's headlamp beam. He'd started the ascent at 2100 hours, operating on instinct and something that felt disturbingly like compulsion. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees in the past hour, and fog pressed against the trees with physical weight. His GPS showed him 2 miles from the shelter, but the forest felt wrong. Daniel had walked this trail dozens of times, knew every switchback and stream crossing. Tonight, the landmark seemed displaced, as if the mountain had shifted in his absence. He stopped to check his bearings. The Garmin display flickered, coordinates jumping erratically before stabilizing. Not unheard of in heavy canopy, but the sky above was clear enough to see stars between the branches. No reason for signal degradation. A sound reached him through the trees, rhythmic and deliberate. Footsteps. Daniel killed his headlamp and moved off the trail, using a massive oak for cover. His hand found the Glock on his hip, though what he expected to shoot at remained unclear. The footsteps grew closer. Too heavy for deer, too steady for bear. Human, but with an odd dragging quality, as if something was wrong with the gait. Daniel's night vision adjusted slowly, picking out shapes in the darkness. A figure emerged from the fog. It was walking upright, heading toward Spence Field with mechanical purpose. Daniel couldn't make out details, but something about the silhouette triggered every predator awareness instinct evolution had granted him. The proportions were wrong, the movements too fluid and too stiff simultaneously. Then it stopped. Daniel held his breath, pressed against the oak's rough bark. The figure stood motionless for 10 seconds. 20. Its head moved, not turning but tilting at an angle that made Daniel's stomach clench. It was looking directly at his hiding spot. Daniel. The voice carried clearly through the still air, female and familiar. I knew you'd come. Sarah's voice. Daniel's rational mind screamed that it was impossible, but his body recognized the truth his consciousness refused. That was Sarah's cadence, her slight Tennessee drawl, the way she emphasized the second syllable of his name. The figure took a step toward him. We can finish what we started, Sarah's voice said from that wrong-shaped silhouette. The survey route, you remember? You promised you'd check on me. Daniel's hand tightened on his weapon. Sarah had been conducting a wildlife survey when she'd fallen. He'd been scheduled to join her the following day. He'd arrived to find rescue teams already searching. You're not real, he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Auditory hallucination. Stress response, guilt manifestation. The figure laughed. Sarah's laugh, but with something underneath it, like two voices overlapping imperfectly. Still so rational. That's what I loved about you, even now, trying to explain me away. It took another step. Daniel could see more details in the starlight filtering through the canopy. Clothes torn and stained, skin too pale, hair hanging in matted strands, and the eyes reflecting his position with an animal's shine. Sarah Chen died 18 months ago, Daniel said, reciting facts like an incantation. Equipment failure. She fell. I saw the body. You saw what they showed you. The thing wearing Sarah's voice moved closer, each step accompanied by that odd dragging sound. Did you see my face, Daniel? Did you look? He hadn't. He'd been unable to. They'd identified her through dental records and personal effects. What do you want? Daniel asked, the question escaping before tactical thinking could stop it. I want you to find her. Melissa. She's in the cemetery, the old settlement past Thunderhead. But you need to hurry. The figure's head tilted further, impossibly far. Before she becomes like me. What are you? Hungry, Sarah's voice whispered. So hungry. The ground here is hungry. It's been hungry since before the park, before the settlers, before the Cherokee knew to leave certain places alone. And when someone dies in the hungry ground, they don't stay dead. Not the way they should. Daniel's headlamp flickered without his touching it, and in that strobe-like illumination he saw the figure clearly for a fraction of a second. The shape was humanoid, but the proportions were wrong. Limbs too long, joints bending at incorrect angles, mouth stretched wider than any human jaw should allow. And the teeth. The light died completely. When it came back on, the trail was empty. Daniel stood trembling against the oak, his weapon trained on nothing. His training screamed at him to retreat, to call for backup, to follow protocol. But Melissa was still out there, and the thing wearing Sarah's voice had given him a location. An old cemetery, past Thunderhead. That matched with stories he'd heard but never investigated. Rumors of a settlement that predated the park's establishment, abandoned in the 1920s. No official records, just folklore passed down by families who'd lived here for generations. He checked his GPS. The coordinates for Thunderhead were 17 miles from his current position. A day's hard hike in good conditions. In darkness, with fog thickening and his hands still shaking from adrenaline, it was borderline suicidal. Daniel started walking. The trail climbed steadily, and the forest grew quieter with each mile. No night birds, no rustle of small mammals, just his footsteps and breathing and the occasional crack of branches in the distance, always behind him, always just out of sight. At 300 hours he reached Spencefield Shelter. The structure sat empty, a 3-sided wooden building designed to sleep 12. Melissa's name was in the logbook, her last entry dated 6 days ago. Beautiful sunset, heading to Rocky Top tomorrow. Life is good. Daniel's light swept across the shelter's interior and caught something on the back wall. Scratches, fresh ones judging by the exposed wood. Not random damage, deliberate marks forming words. They smile with dirt in their teeth below that, in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. Don't let them bite you. Daniel's radio crackled. He grabbed it instinctively, but the transmission was wordless. Just that wet, rasping breathing again. Then a voice, distorted but recognizable as Melissa's from her emergency contact recording. Cemetery. Can't leave. Something's wrong with my mouth. The transmission cut off. Daniel photographed the wall with his digital camera, forcing his hand steady. Evidence, documentation, procedure. The familiar rituals kept panic at bay. Outside, fog had transformed the meadow into a gray void. His GPS showed the route to Thunderhead continuing north. But when Daniel consulted his topographic map, he noticed something he'd missed before. There was an alternative route, an unofficial trail marked in pencil on his personal copy, added by a Cherokee ranger who'd worked here in the 90s before retiring. The note beside it read, Old Way, Settler's Path, "Don't take after dark." Daniel had questioned the warning when he'd first seen it, had asked the ranger what it meant. The old man had looked at him with eyes that had seen too much and said simply, "Some places remember the dead, and some dead remember being alive." The unofficial trail would cut the distance to Thunderhead by 5 miles. Daniel stood at the junction, his rational mind warring with the urgency pounding through his veins. Every training session, every safety briefing, every hard-learned lesson screamed at him to take the official route, to wait for daylight, to call for backup. But Melissa's voice on that impossible transmission, "Can't leave. Something's wrong with my mouth." He turned onto the settler's path. The unofficial trail descended into forest so old it felt primordial. Trees here had grown massive, their trunks wider than Daniel was tall, their canopy blocking starlight completely. His headlamp beam carved a narrow tunnel through absolute darkness. The path itself was barely visible, just a depression in the undergrowth that might have been animal trail or ancient footpath. Daniel's GPS refused to display the route, coordinates flickering erratically. He navigated by compass and instinct, trusting the downward slope to lead him toward the valley where Thunderhead rose. At 4:45 hours, he found the first grave marker. It was crude, a flat stone with a name carved in rough letters, Ephraim Collins, 1821-1847. The grave sat just off the trail, partially obscured by roots. Daniel almost missed it in his focus on the path ahead. Then he saw the second marker, and the third. They appeared at irregular intervals, scattered through the forest with no apparent organization. Names and dates from the early 19th century, most barely legible. No Christian symbols, no Bible verses, just names and the years that bracketed short, brutal lives. Daniel counted 27 graves before he stopped counting. The temperature continued dropping. His breath formed clouds that hung motionless in the air, defying the subtle breeze moving through the upper canopy. The cold had a physical presence pressing against exposed skin like hands made of ice. A twig snapped behind him. Daniel spun, his headlamp sweeping across trees and undergrowth. Nothing. But the sound had been close, deliberate. Something stepping on deadfall with enough weight to break wood. "Melissa," he called, hating the tremor that crept into his voice. "If you can hear me, make a sound. I'm here to help." Silence. Then, from his right, a soft scraping, nails on bark, or perhaps teeth. Daniel moved the light toward the sound. At the edge of his beam, something pale shifted behind a tree. "I'm a park ranger. You're safe now. Let me see you." The pale thing moved into the light. It had been human once. The clothing, torn hiking gear, matched Melissa's description. But the body had changed in ways that violated every principle of forensic decomposition Daniel had studied. The skin was gray-white, stretched too tight over bones that had elongated subtly, disturbingly. The hands ended in fingers that were too long, nails blackened and sharp. And the mouth, Christ, the mouth was open far wider than any living human could manage, packed with soil that spilled from the corners in dark streams. The thing that had been Melissa tilted its head at the same impossible angle Daniel had seen earlier. When it spoke, dirt fell from its lips in clumps. "You came for me." The voice was Melissa's, but filtered through a throat full of earth. "I waited. Like she told me to. She said you would come." Daniel's hand found his weapon, but he couldn't make himself raise it. This was what he'd come to find. Melissa Hartwell, reported missing, feared dead, except she was neither missing nor fully dead, and every training manual he'd ever read had nothing to say about this situation. "Melissa, I need you to stay calm," he said automatically, the words absurd even as he spoke them. "We're going to get you help." "Help?" The thing laughed and more dirt rattled from its teeth. "I'm home now. We're all home. The ground takes us back, and we take care of the ground. That's how it works here. That's how it's always worked." She took a step toward him, her gait that same dragging wrong movement he'd observed earlier. "She's waiting for you. At the cemetery. She wants to show you something." "Who's waiting?" "Sarah." Melissa's face attempted a smile, lips splitting at the corners. "She's been waiting since she fell. Waiting for the ground to wake her up properly. waiting for you to come back so she could share what she learned. Daniel's rational mind, already fracturing, attempted one last defensive maneuver. Temporal lobe seizure, hypoxia-induced hallucination, carbon monoxide from volcanic seepage. Keep telling yourself stories, Daniel. Melissa moved closer, and Daniel could see the dirt writhing in her mouth, not falling passively but moving with intention, as if the soil itself was alive. The ground doesn't care what you call it. The ground just wants what it's owed. More figures emerged from the trees. 12, 24, all with that same gray-pale skin, those same 2 long limbs, those same mouths packed with living earth. Some wore clothing from this decade. Others wore scraps that could have been from the 1800s. They formed a loose circle around Daniel, not threatening, just waiting, watching with eyes that reflected light and colors human eyes shouldn't produce. "The cemetery is close," Melissa said conversationally, as if they were discussing weather. "Half a mile east. You'll know it by the gates, iron. Never rusted. Funny how iron holds, even when everything else rots." "What happened to you?" Daniel asked, the question barely a whisper. "I died." She said it matter-of-factly. "Fell on the rocks past Thunderhead. Broke my neck, should have been the end." Her head tilted further, vertebrae grinding audibly. "But the ground here is old, hungry. It takes what falls into it and gives back something that can feed it more. You know the word for us, don't you? From the old stories?" Daniel did. He'd researched folklore obsessively after Sarah's death, looking for any explanation that made sense. Romanian legends, Slavic mythology, tales of the undead brought back by earth tainted with evil. "Strigoi," he whispered. Melissa's smile widened impossibly. "Good. You understand. That makes it easier." "Makes what easier?" "The choice." She gestured toward the darkness behind her. "Sarah's waiting. She has something to show you. Something that will make you understand why we have to stay. Why the ground needs us. Why it's going to need you, too." The other figures moved closer, their circle tightening. Daniel raised his weapon finally, knowing it was futile. "Stay back." "We don't want to hurt you," Melissa said. And the terrible thing was that she sounded genuine. "We want you to understand. To choose." She chose. "I chose. Now it's your turn." "I'm not choosing anything." "You already did. The moment you followed her voice. The moment you stepped onto the old path." Melissa's eyes, filmed with something that wasn't quite cataracts, fixed on him with disturbing intensity. "You've been choosing since Sarah fell. Since you couldn't save her. Since you decided guilt was easier than letting go." Daniel's finger tightened on the trigger, but he couldn't fire. Because despite everything, despite the horror of what stood before him, Melissa's words carried the weight of truth he'd been avoiding for 18 months. "Go to the cemetery, Daniel," she said softly, dirt tumbling from her lips like prayer beads. "See what she wants to show you, then decide." The figures parted, creating a gap in their circle, an invitation, or a command. Daniel walked through them, his skin crawling as he passed close enough to smell the grave earth stench emanating from their bodies. None of them touched him. They simply watched, patient and eternal, as he moved deeper into the forest. Behind him, Melissa called out, "One warning, Daniel. The dead who remember being alive are dangerous. But the dead who remember being loved, they're worse." The cemetery announced itself with iron gates that stood 12 feet high, black metal worked into patterns that hurt to look at directly. They were open, welcoming, rust-free, despite what must have been a century of exposure. Beyond the gates, grave markers rose from ground that had been cleared of undergrowth but showed no signs of human maintenance. The stones stood in neat rows, names and dates still legible in Daniel's headlamp beam. The newest he could see was from 1929. The oldest was worn smooth by time. And at the center of the cemetery, beside a mausoleum built from stone that seemed to drink light rather than reflect it, stood Sarah. She looked exactly as he remembered, before the fall, before the funeral, before the nightmares. Her ranger uniform was crisp, her hair pulled back in the practical ponytail she'd favored. She smiled when she saw him, that same warm expression that had convinced him to transfer to the Smokies in the first place, 3 years ago, when they'd been partners and something more. "Hey, Daniel," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the cemetery. "I knew you'd figure it out." Daniel stopped 10 feet from the gates. Every survival instinct screamed at him to run, but something stronger kept him rooted. The need to understand. The need to know if any of this was real. "Sarah's dead," he said, clinical and cold. "I went to her funeral. I helped carry the casket. You carried a box with some of my remains," she corrected gently. "Most of me stayed here. The ground took what it needed, gave back what it wanted." She spread her hands, inviting inspection. "You see? I'm more myself now than I ever was alive. You're a corpse." The word came out harsh, desperate. "You're dead tissue animated by something that shouldn't exist. Is that your scientific explanation?" She moved closer to the gates but didn't cross them. "Or is it easier to believe that than to accept what I'm offering?" "What are you offering?" Sarah's expression softened. "An end to guilt, to regret, to all the should-haves and could-haves that have been eating you alive since I fell." She gestured to the cemetery. "Here, we don't hurt anymore. Don't age. Don't worry about failure or loss. We just exist and serve and wait. Wait for what? For the ground to be fed, for more to fall and rise and join us." Her smile never wavered. "For people like you who are already halfway here anyway." Daniel shook his head, but the gesture felt weak. "I came for Melissa, to rescue her, to bring her home. She is home. We're all home. This ground has been hungry since before humans named it. The Cherokee knew. That's why their burial sites are elsewhere, why they have stories about certain valleys where spirits walk wrong. The settlers learned too late." Sarah moved along the fence line, graceful and wrong. "They tried to leave. The ground wouldn't let them. They died here and died again until they understood their purpose. Which is? To feed it more, to call others, to expand the hungry ground's reach, one death at a time." She stopped, meeting his eyes directly. "I've been doing my part. Melissa was the 4th this year. But you're different. Special. The ground wants you specifically. Why? Because you were already dying inside. Because guilt has been hollowing you out since I fell. Because you blame yourself for not being there, for not checking my equipment, for not somehow preventing the inevitable." Sarah's voice dropped to something almost tender. "And because I asked for you, called for you. The ground grants requests sometimes, when we've served it well." Daniel's hand moved to his weapon again, but Sarah laughed, genuinely, without malice. "You can't kill what's already dead, Daniel. You can only join us." She extended her hand through the iron bars. "It's easy. Just step through the gates. Let the ground take you. Let it wake you up to what comes after. And if I refuse? Then you leave. Walk back the way you came. File your report. Tell them Melissa Hartwell died of exposure or animal attack or equipment failure. Whatever story helps you sleep at night." Her hand remained extended. "But you'll never stop wondering. Never stop hearing my voice on the radio. Never stop seeing us in the dark places of the park." Daniel stared at that offered hand. Sarah's hand, familiar and beloved, now pale as marble and cold as grave earth. Everything he'd been trained to believe about reality said this was impossible. Hallucination, breakdown, trauma response. But reality had already proven insufficient, hadn't it? "Show me," he said quietly. "Show me what you wanted me to see." Sarah's smile widened. She withdrew her hand and gestured to the mausoleum. "Inside. But you have to enter the cemetery first. You have to choose to cross the threshold." Daniel looked at the gates. Ancient iron, worked by hands that had understood something about this place that modern rangers never would. Gates that stood open, inviting, patient. He thought about 18 months of guilt, of waking at 3 a.m. convinced he heard Sarah calling for help, of walking the trail where she died, looking for something, anything, that would make her loss make sense. He thought about Melissa, transformed into something that wore her face but served the hungry ground. He thought about all the missing persons reports from the Smokies over the decades, the bodies never found, the disappearances written off as accidents or animal predation or voluntary walkaway. And he thought about the voice on the radio that had known Sarah's name. Daniel stepped through the gates. The change was immediate and profound. The air inside the cemetery felt different, thicker, older, saturated with a presence that had weight and intention. His headlamp dimmed, as if the darkness here was stronger than light could compensate for. Sarah walked beside him toward the mausoleum, her proximity no longer frightening, just familiar. "The ground is strongest here," she said conversationally. "Concentrated. This is where the settlement buried their first dead, before they understood what they were creating. By the time they realized, it was too late to leave." The mausoleum door was stone, carved with symbols that predated any European settlement. Cherokee, maybe, or something older. Something that had tried to warn away what was coming. Sarah pushed it open. Inside, the space was larger than should have been possible, extending down into the earth in a spiral of stone steps. Shelves carved into the walls held remains, not just bones, but bodies in various states of preservation and transformation. Some looked recently deceased, others were withered, mummified, and some were moving. "The ground doesn't just take," Sarah explained, leading him deeper. "It gives back. Purpose, continuation, a reason to exist beyond the biological imperative." She stopped at a landing where the walls opened into a chamber. Look, the chamber was vast, cathedral-like, carved from living rock. And throughout it, hanging from the ceiling on roots that seemed to grow from stone itself, were bodies. Dozens of them. Hundreds. All in various stages of transformation, their flesh merging with root and earth, their faces frozen in expressions that might have been agony or ecstasy, or something beyond human categorization. "This is what the ground builds," Sarah said softly. "This is what we serve. Not death, not life, something in between. Something that's been growing here since before the mountain had a name." Daniel stared at the impossible architecture of flesh and root and stone. His mind cataloged details automatically. The way the roots entered through mouths and nostrils, the way bodies seemed to breathe in unison, the way eyes still moved in skull sockets that should have been empty. "You were an analyst," Sarah said. "So analyze. What do you see?" Daniel saw the truth he'd been running from since she'd died. Not a truth about the supernatural or the hungry ground or the strigoi of old legends. A truth about himself. "I see a choice," he said quietly, "between accepting loss and hiding from it." "Yes." Sarah's hand touched his shoulder. "And which do you choose?" Daniel looked at her. Really looked. Past the familiar features to what animated them now. Past his guilt to the reality of what she'd become. And he made his choice. "I choose to remember you alive," he said, and raised his weapon. Sarah didn't move as he aimed, didn't flinch, just smiled sadly. "The bullets won't work, Daniel. I told you. I'm not shooting you." He fired 3 times into the ceiling of the chamber, targeting the thickest cluster of roots. The structure screamed. Not with sound, with sensation. A wave of fury and hunger and violation that crashed through Daniel's consciousness like physical impact. The bodies hanging from roots convulsed. The roots themselves writhed, pulling back from the bullet damage, revealing raw stone beneath. Sarah's face contorted. "What are you?" Daniel ran. Up the stairs, through the mausoleum, out into the cemetery where dawn was beginning to gray the sky. Behind him, that psychic scream intensified, and he heard the pursuit, not footsteps, but something sliding, dragging, pulling itself toward him, with the sound of earth collapsing inward. He threw himself through the iron gates and didn't stop running until he'd reached the official trail, the morning sun breaking over the peaks in light that felt like salvation. The official report was simple. Melissa Hartwell, deceased, body not recovered, presumed animal attack. Daniel Torres, minor injuries from unauthorized solo search, recommended for counseling. Daniel sat in Bill's office 3 days later, accepting coffee he wouldn't drink and questions he couldn't answer. The mandatory psychiatric evaluation was scheduled for next week. His weapon had been temporarily surrendered for ballistics testing, standard procedure when rounds were discharged in the field. "You want to tell me what really happened out there?" Bill asked, not unkindly. Daniel thought about the cemetery, about Sarah, about the choice he'd made to destroy rather than join. "I got lost. Discharged my weapon at a perceived threat. Found evidence of Hartwell's death but couldn't recover remains due to terrain." Bill studied him. "And the radio transmission? The one you cited in your initial report?" "Atmospheric interference, misidentification. I was exhausted, not thinking clearly." "Daniel, I'm fine, Bill. I just need some time." Bill sighed. "Take a week. Paid leave. Get your head straight." Daniel nodded and left. That night, his radio woke him at 0300 hours. Static filled his apartment, and through it, Sarah's voice. "You can't destroy what's been growing for centuries, Daniel. You just made it angry." He unplugged the radio. It kept transmitting. "We're coming for you," Sarah whispered through speakers that had no power. "The ground is hungry, and you showed it where you live." Daniel looked out his window at the parking lot below. Figures stood in the darkness, too far away to identify clearly. But their postures were wrong, their shapes off, their stillness too perfect. They were waiting. They had always been waiting. And Daniel understood finally that some choices don't end when you make them. Some choices echo. Some grounds stay hungry no matter how far you run. He grabbed his keys and his pack. Didn't know where he'd go. Didn't matter. The hungry ground knew where he lived now. It would follow. It was patient, and it had all the time that death allowed. The ice shouldn't have been there at all. William Archer stood at the edge of Knife Lake, staring at the crystalline formations spreading across the water's surface like frozen spider webs. It was July 18, 2011. The temperature gauge on his Garmin GPS map 64 read 84 degrees Fahrenheit. The sun hammered down on his shoulders with the full weight of a Minnesota summer, yet 20 feet from shore, the lake wore a skin of frost that couldn't exist. He'd been a ranger in the Superior National Forest for 8 years, the last 3 specifically assigned to the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. William had a degree in environmental science from the University of Minnesota, a minor in climatology, and a methodical mind that solved problems through data and logic. He understood thermal inversions, microclimates, and atmospheric anomalies. None of them explained ice forming in 84-degree heat, while dragonflies traced patterns through the air above it. The sun climbed higher. The ice didn't melt. William pulled out his field notebook and documented the observation with clinical precision. Temperature, humidity, wind speed, exact coordinates. The ice measured approximately 6 feet in diameter, centered around what appeared to be a submerged object. He photographed it from multiple angles with his department-issued Nikon, the camera's timestamp confirming the impossibility. Then he marked the location on his GPS and continued north along the Portage Trail toward the last known position of Kayla Morrison. The 23-year-old had been reported missing 4 days ago by the outfitter in Ely who'd rented her a canoe. She'd planned a solo 5-day trip through the Boundary Waters, experienced enough for the wilderness but not experienced enough to ignore protocols. When she hadn't returned on schedule, the outfitter had called it in. Standard procedure for this region. People got lost, equipment failed, weather turned. Usually they walked out embarrassed but alive. William had taken the case because the missing persons file contained an odd detail. 3 other solo campers had vanished in this same corridor over the past 18 months. The Forest Service had attributed them to bear attacks, drownings, or simple disorientation in the maze of interconnected lakes and portages. Accidents, statistics, nothing that required deeper investigation. But William had pulled the incident reports and noticed something the others had missed. All 4 disappearances had occurred between July 15th and July 22nd. All 4 had been experienced wilderness campers. All 4 had last been seen heading north from Knife Lake toward the Canadian border, following the same chain of portages through increasingly remote terrain. And in the reports from search teams who'd looked for the previous 3, William had found 7 separate mentions of unseasonably cold conditions and unusual frost patterns during the height of summer. The ice on Knife Lake had been his first physical confirmation that something more than random chance connected these cases. William reached Kayla Morrison's last registered campsite at 10:47 a.m. The clearing sat on a narrow peninsula jutting into Vera Lake, one of the smaller bodies of water in the labyrinth of the Boundary Waters. The Forest Service's satellite imaging showed it as campsite number 47, a designated spot marked on the official BWCA maps. Basic fire ring, flat area for a tent, good access to water. Nothing special, nothing dangerous. The tent was still standing. That fact alone shifted the situation from probable accident to something that required more careful attention. In William's experience, when campers abandoned sites in distress, they either took their tents or left them in disarray, collapsed from panic, torn from bears, or scattered by weather. Kayla Morrison's tent stood perfectly erect, door zippered closed, stakes driven into the ground with precise spacing, the kind of setup someone made when they intended to return. William pulled on nitrile gloves before touching anything. He wasn't law enforcement, but 8 years in this wilderness had taught him that sometimes what looked like an accident investigation became something else entirely. The tent's interior revealed more contradictions. Kayla's sleeping bag lay neatly rolled in one corner. Her backpack sat upright near the tent's rear, partially unpacked. A LED headlamp hung from the ceiling loop, still switched on, but its batteries long dead. Her water filtration system, a Katahdin Hiker Pro, rested beside the backpack alongside 2 full Nalgene bottles. Food bag hung properly in a tree 30 feet from camp. Bear protocol observed correctly. Everything suggested someone who knew what they were doing and had left with the intention of coming back soon. Perhaps a short hike, a bathroom break, something that shouldn't have taken more than an hour. But Kayla Morrison hadn't come back, and her tent had been standing empty for 4 days. William documented everything with photographs and notes, building a mental inventory of what was present and what was missing. Kayla's life jacket hung from a tree branch near the canoe landing. Her canoe was pulled up on shore, properly secured. Her park-issued bear canister sat locked near the fire ring. What was missing? Her boots. The hiking boots that should have been in the tent's vestibule were gone. Also missing, her first aid kit, which according to her gear list filed with the outfitter should have been a standard adventure medical kits package, and her knife, a Benchmade bushcrafter that her father had mentioned specifically when filing the missing person report. A 16th birthday present she never traveled without. So she'd left camp wearing boots, carrying a knife and first aid kit, planning to come back, planning to be prepared for something. William circled the campsite perimeter, moving in expanding arcs, reading the ground. The Boundary Water soil held prints well near water, especially in the mud along the shoreline. He found Kayla's boot treads immediately. Vask brand, women's size 7, distinctive lug pattern. They led away from camp heading northeast, following what might have been a game trail, or might have been nothing at all. The forest here grew thick with paper birch and balsam fir, undergrowth dense enough to make off-trail travel challenging. He followed the prints for 20 yards before they vanished completely. Not faded into harder ground. Vanished. One moment clear impressions in soft earth, the next moment nothing at all, as if Kayla Morrison had simply stepped into empty air and ceased to exist. William spent 40 minutes searching for where the trail resumed. He employed grid search patterns, used his compass to ensure he didn't circle, marked trees with surveyor's tape to track his coverage. The boot prints never reappeared. He was kneeling to examine a disturbance in the leaf litter when he heard the sound. At first his mind categorized it as wind through trees, but the air hung absolutely still, not even enough breeze to move the mosquitoes that formed clouds around his head. The sound came again. A low, resonant tone that seemed to emerge from the forest itself, rather than any specific direction. Not wind, not animal. Something that made his inner ear ache and his teeth feel loose in their gums. William stood slowly, one hand moving to the Motorola XPR 7550 radio on his belt. The sound faded, leaving only the normal ambient noise of wilderness. Birdsong, insect hum, the distant lap of water on stone. He keyed the radio. Ranger Archer to base, checking in from Vera Lake, campsite 47. Static answered him. Not the normal static of poor reception. The boundary waters had dead zones, that was standard, but something denser, almost textured. Like audio interference layered over itself in patterns that his brain tried to resolve into words but couldn't quite manage. He tried again. Same result. William checked his GPS. The satellite lock was solid, coordinates precise. He was exactly where he should be, in an area where radio communication usually worked fine. The equipment was functioning normally according to all diagnostic indicators. Yet when he tried to call base again, the static came back, and this time he was certain he heard something underneath it. Not words, not quite, but something that had the rhythm of speech, the cadence of language, pronounced in sounds that human vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce. He switched off the radio and stood in the silence of the clearing, analyzing his own reaction. Elevated heart rate, mild perspiration despite the shade. A tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. His body was responding to something his conscious mind hadn't fully processed yet. Fear, he noted clinically. He was experiencing fear. William forced himself to examine that emotion objectively. What was the actual threat? Unknown sounds could be explained by atmospheric conditions, geological formations, creating acoustic anomalies, even migraine auras, producing auditory hallucinations. The radio interference had a dozen possible technical explanations. The missing boot prints simply meant he hadn't found where they continued yet. The ice on Knife Lake in July heat. That thought arrived unwelcome. He pushed it aside and focused on concrete data. He had a missing person, an abandoned campsite, and evidence of unusual environmental conditions. Standard protocol required him to mark the location, document everything he'd found, return to base, and request a full search and rescue team. He took one more photograph of the campsite and turned to head back toward his canoe. The clearing had changed. William froze, his rational mind struggling to process what his eyes were reporting. The campsite looked the same, tent still standing, fire ring in the same position, canoe where he'd last seen it. But the light had shifted somehow. The shadows fell at wrong angles for late morning, stretching too long from trees that hadn't cast those shadows moments before. The temperature had dropped at least 15 degrees. He could see his breath misting in the air. In July, in Minnesota, at midday. He pulled out his Garmin. The temperature sensor now read 51 degrees. He'd been at the campsite for 48 minutes according to his watch. The GPS confirmed his position. Everything electronic functioned normally, cheerfully displaying impossible data. William's scientific training fought against what his senses were telling him. Microclimates didn't shift this rapidly. Localized cold fronts didn't manifest in isolated clearings. The sun still shone overhead with summer intensity, yet the air around him felt like October at dusk. He moved toward his canoe, fighting the urge to run. Running was what panicked people did. Running was how experienced campers got lost and died from exposure. He would walk calmly to his canoe, paddle back to his entry point, report everything he'd found, and let the search team deal with whatever atmospheric anomaly was affecting this region. The sound came back as he reached for the canoe. Louder this time. Closer. That same resonant tone, but now it carried harmonics that made his fillings ache and his vision blur at the edges. Not wind, not animal, something vocal, something that was using sound the way a predator used teeth. William grabbed the canoe and dragged it toward the water. His hands were shaking. He noticed this with distant surprise. His body was overriding his rational mind's attempts at calm analysis. Some deeper part of his nervous system, some ancient mammalian core that predated logic and reason, was screaming warnings that higher thought couldn't suppress. The water at the shoreline had begun to freeze. He watched ice crystallize across the surface in branching fractals, spreading outward from the shore in patterns that looked almost purposeful. The temperature gauge on his GPS dropped to 41 degrees, then 34. The device was functioning perfectly, displaying readings that couldn't be real. William set the canoe down and stepped back from the spreading ice. His breath came in visible clouds. The trees around the clearing had begun to creak and groan despite the windless air, wood contracting in cold that had arrived without transition, without warning, without any meteorological explanation. He needed to leave. The rational part of his mind finally agreed with the screaming animal part. Whatever was happening here went beyond unusual weather. This was something else. Something wrong. The boot prints reappeared. Fresh prints, pressed into ground that had been empty minutes ago. Kayla Morrison's distinctive Vasque treads, heading not northeast away from camp but directly toward William. A line of prints that emerged from nowhere and traced a path to where he stood. Except they weren't quite Kayla's prints. As William stared at them, his mind processing details that didn't fit, he saw that the stride length was wrong. Too long. Each step covered nearly 6 feet, a span that would require someone 7 or 8 feet tall, and the depth of the impression suggested weight far beyond what a 120-pound woman should produce. Something wearing Kayla Morrison's boots had walked here recently. Something that was not Kayla Morrison. The sound came again, and this time William's rational mind surrendered completely to the simple, overwhelming truth of terror. The tone resonated through the clearing with a frequency that seemed designed specifically to trigger panic in human nervous systems. It was hunger given voice. Not the hunger of an animal seeking food, but something vaster and emptier. Hunger as a state of being. Hunger as an identity. Hunger that could never be filled, no matter how much it consumed. William ran. He left the canoe, left the campsite, crashed through undergrowth along the lake's shore, heading south back toward the Portage Trail. Branches tore at his face. Roots threatened to trip him. His rational mind had shut down entirely, leaving only the mammalian imperative to flee, to put distance between himself and the thing that made that sound. Behind him, the temperature continued to drop. Ice spread across Vera Lake's surface in defiance of thermodynamics and season. The trees groaned louder, their wood splitting in the sudden cold. And somewhere in the forest, close, much too close, something moved with a stride that covered 6 feet at a time, following tracks only it could see. William reached the Portage Trail at full sprint. His training should have told him that running in wilderness was dangerous, that panic killed more people than bears or cold or starvation. But his training had been built on the assumption that the world followed certain rules. That temperature didn't drop 40 degrees in minutes. That ice didn't form in July. That things in the forest didn't wear stolen boots and make sounds that turned a person's skeleton to liquid terror. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to collapse, driven by a fear so primal it bypassed all higher thinking. Ran until he realized he had no idea where he was. The Portage Trail was gone. William stopped, gasping, and turned in a slow circle. He stood in forest that looked identical in every direction. Paper birch and balsam fir, undergrowth thick with ferns and moss. No trail markers, no sight lines to water. No way to orient himself except by the sun, which now hung in a position that didn't match the time on his watch. His Garmin still showed a solid satellite lock. According to the GPS, he stood exactly where he'd started, at the shore of Vera Lake, at campsite 47, coordinates that couldn't be argued with. But he wasn't at Vera Lake. He was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere the GPS couldn't properly report because it had no category for forests that moved, for trails that disappeared, for spaces that stopped obeying the geometry his device had been programmed to measure. William forced his breathing to slow, forced his mind back toward rationality. He was lost. That was unfortunate, but manageable. He had training for this. He carried emergency supplies, water filtration, a compass that didn't rely on satellites. The Boundary Waters was large but finite. Eventually he would find water, and water would lead to roots, and roots would lead to civilization. The temperature read 29 degrees. Ice crystals had begun to form on the trees around him. He pulled out his compass and watched the needle spin lazily in circles, unable to find north, unable to find anything except its own confused rotation. Another instrument reporting impossible data. Another piece of reliable equipment revealing that reliability itself had become negotiable. From somewhere in the forest came that sound again. The hungry sound. The sound that had no right to exist in a world governed by scientific law. And underneath it, woven through it, William heard something else. A voice. Human speech, though the language was nothing he recognized. Syllables that scraped against his hearing like broken glass. Words that his mind refused to fully process because processing them would require accepting truths his worldview had no room for. The voice was calling something. Or perhaps it was calling to something. William started walking, picking a direction at random since his compass offered no guidance. He would move until he found water or a landmark or something that made sense. He would maintain his calm. He would not run again. Running was what panicked people did, and William Archer was not a person who panicked. He was a person who solved problems through logic and method and careful observation of data. Except all his data was wrong. All his instruments were lying. And something in the forest was following him, getting closer with each stride of those impossibly long steps. The trees ahead of him were dead. William stopped at the boundary between living forest and what lay beyond. A line as sharp as a knife stroke divided healthy summer growth from a wasteland of frozen, blackened trees. On his side, green leaves, thick undergrowth, the normal chaos of wilderness in July. On the other side, winter. Not seasonal winter that came with snow and explanation, but something else. A winter that had nothing to do with Earth's axial tilt or distance from the sun. A winter that existed as a presence, an entity, a thing that had claimed this territory and reshaped it according to rules from somewhere outside his understanding. The voice came again, much closer now. Those scraping syllables, that broken glass language. And William realized with sick certainty that he recognized some of the phonemes. Not because he'd heard this language before, but because he'd read about it. In obscure anthropology journals and folklore collections that his rational mind had dismissed as superstition. Algonquian languages, Ojibwe, Cree, or one of their cousins, spoken by something that had once known those languages intimately, had once been human enough to form those words, before hunger had transformed it into something else entirely. William's hand moved to his belt, fingers finding the cold metal of his radio. He tried one more time, knowing it was futile but needing the ritual of attempted contact, the reaching out toward the normal world he'd left behind. Ranger Archer requesting emergency assistance. Position unknown. Require immediate extraction. The static that answered him carried that underlying voice again, and this time the words almost made sense. Almost. A sentence in English filtered through something that didn't quite remember how human mouths worked. She ran too. Fast runner. Good meal. Still hungry. William dropped the radio and bolted into the dead forest. Later he wouldn't remember making the decision to cross that boundary. Fear had become something absolute, a force that overrode every other consideration. The rational man who'd started this day solving a missing person case with scientific method had been stripped away, leaving only the animal underneath. The animal that knew predators existed, that understood the reality of being hunted, that didn't care about impossibilities or data contradictions when something hungry was closing in. The dead forest was colder. The temperature gauge on his Garmin, still somehow functioning, still cheerfully reporting, showed 18 degrees. Frost covered every surface. The trees didn't just look frozen, they looked consumed, drained of something essential that had nothing to do with heat or moisture. They stood as hollow shells, their bark splitting to reveal wood that looked almost porous, almost digested. Behind him, moving between the living trees and the dead ones with the ease of something that belonged in both worlds, the hunter followed. William saw it for the first time as a shadow against birch bark. Too tall, wrong proportions. A silhouette that suggested a human figure the way a praying mantis suggested prayer. similar architecture put to utterly alien purpose. It moved with a gait that covered impossible distance, each stride flowing rather than stepping, as if it didn't quite touch the ground or didn't quite need to. He ran harder, lungs burning in the cold air, legs pumping through frost-stiff ferns. The forest around him grew darker despite the sun that still theoretically shone overhead. Not dark with shadow, but dark with absence. Absence of light, of warmth, of the normal background energy that living things produced simply by existing. This place was where that energy had been consumed, eaten, digested into something that fed the thing behind him. William crashed through a curtain of frozen branches and stumbled into another clearing. This one was smaller than Kayla Morrison's campsite, barely 20 feet across, but it held evidence of human presence. A backpack partially buried in frost, a sleeping bag torn into ribbons, a hiking boot, Vasca brand, women's size 7, lying on its side near a fire ring that had never held fire. Kayla Morrison's first campsite, the one she'd made before moving to Vera Lake. On the ground near the boot, something gleamed in the dim light. William's eyes found it automatically, his ranger training identifying the object even as his conscious mind recoiled from its implications. A knife. Bench-made bushcrafter. The blade was clean. The handle showed no damage. It lay exactly where someone would drop it if they'd been holding it defensively, backing away from something, and then turned to run so fast that they'd simply released their grip rather than waste time sheathing the weapon. Kayla Morrison had made her stand here, had tried to defend herself, had failed. The voice behind him spoke again, those Algonquian syllables scraping against reality. Witiko, Atim, Namakos, words that William's linguistic knowledge recognized even as his sanity tried to reject them. Wendigo, dog, trout, a litany of things consumed, a catalog of hunger never satisfied. He turned slowly, knowing flight was pointless, knowing he'd been herded here deliberately, knowing that whatever he was about to face had been toying with him from the start. The thing stood at the clearing's edge, still partially obscured by frozen trees. Tall, at least 8 feet, gaunt in a way that had nothing to do with starvation, and everything to do with something that existed in a permanent state of incompleteness. It wore remnants of clothing, though whether these were Kayla Morrison's or belonged to earlier victims, William couldn't tell. Its face was wrong in a way his eyes struggled to resolve. Features that suggested a human skull elongated and sharpened, jaw that hinged wider than any human jaw should open. But the eyes were the worst. Yellow-white, like old bone or ancient ice. They held an intelligence that was absolutely human and absolutely gone. The awareness of something that had once been a person, that remembered being a person, but had been consumed from within by hunger so vast it had devoured everything else. Memory, emotion, mercy, even the basic shape of humanity itself. William's voice came out as a whisper. Wendigo. The thing's head tilted, considering. Then it smiled, revealing teeth that had been filed or had grown into points. A mouth full of cutting edges designed for only one purpose. Smart, it said in English that came from a throat never meant for the language. She screamed, you name it. Still hungry, though, always hungry. Forever hungry. It took a step forward, and William realized the ground beneath it crystallized into frost with each footfall. The thing carried winter with it, dragged cold like a cloak, existed as a violation of thermodynamics and season and life itself. He scrambled backward, hand finding Kayla Morrison's dropped knife without conscious thought. The benchmade felt solid in his grip, real in a way nothing else had felt for the last hour. Cold metal, decent balance, completely inadequate for what he faced, but better than nothing. The Wendigo laughed, and the sound had the same hungry resonance as that initial call. Knife didn't help her. Knife won't help you. Nothing helps. Already ate your friend. Already ate 3 before. Already ate the tribe that named me. Still hungry. Always more hungry. It moved with that flowing stride, covering half the clearing's distance in one step. William slashed with the knife, aiming for anything, connecting with nothing. The thing was there and then wasn't, leaving only the cold and the scent of meat left too long in a freezer that didn't quite preserve. You know what I am. the Wendigo said, circling now, enjoying this. You know the stories. Curse of the North. Punishment for taboo. Starvation made flesh. It leaned closer, and William could see that what he'd taken for clothing were actually strips of skin, its own skin perhaps, or victim's skin, sloughing off and regrowing in an eternal cycle of consumption and reconstitution. But do you know why I hunt here? Why this forest? Why these lakes? William backed against a frozen tree, knife extended uselessly. His rational mind had returned now that flight was impossible, analyzing the situation with the crystal clarity of absolute terror. The Wendigo wasn't just hunting. It was playing. It wanted him to understand. Boundary waters. The thing continued, its voice like wind through ice. Boundaries. Edges. Places where worlds touch. Where the real bleeds into the more than real. Where old hungers can wake and feed and never be satisfied. It gestured with one impossibly long arm at the forest around them. You think this is wilderness? You think you came here to protect nature? The laugh again, scraping and hungry. You came to feed me. They all come to feed me. Solo campers, experienced, careful, perfect prey. They know enough to travel alone, far enough to find where I wait. Smart enough to make the hunt interesting. William's training reasserted itself in fragments. Keep it talking. Engaged predators sometimes made mistakes. Sometimes. The others, the three before Kayla Morrison, you, ate them, the Wendigo finished. Slowly, carefully, made them last. But never enough, never filling. Just makes hunger bigger, stronger. It moved closer, and William could see frost forming on his own hands now, ice crystals growing from his skin. Your blood is already slowing. Cold is already taking you, makes the meat tender. His fingers were going numb around the knife handle. The garment on his belt showed 14 degrees and dropping. His body was shutting down, systems going into emergency conservation mode, pulling blood from extremities to protect his core. He had minutes before hypothermia took his ability to think, to move, to do anything except freeze. The Wendigo reached for him with a hand that was too long, fingers that ended in something between nails and claws. William swung the Benchmade in desperation, and miracle of miracles connected. The blade bit into the thing's forearm, cutting through skin that felt like frozen leather. No blood emerged. Instead, something like ice crystals and black smoke poured from the wound. The Wendigo hissed and jerked back, more surprised than hurt. Iron, it said, examining the cut with those bone-yellow eyes. Forged. Blessed? No. But made with intention, carried with love, her father's gift. It looked at William with something that might have been respect or might have been hunger intensified. Good knife. Won't save you, though. William's legs gave out. The cold had reached critical mass, his core temperature dropping past the point where voluntary movement was possible. He slumped against the frozen tree, knife falling from fingers that couldn't hold it anymore. His mind remained clear, hypothermia's final cruelty. But his body had become a prison, systems shutting down one by one. The Wendigo leaned over him, its face filling his vision. That elongated skull, that too wide jaw, those eyes that held all the awareness of the person it had once been, trapped inside something that existed only to consume. You'll understand soon, it whispered. When the hunger starts. When it eats everything else. When you become what I am. 4 seasons, they say. 4 seasons from death to transformation. But I'm old now. Strong. Can speed the process. Can make you into Wendigo while you still breathe. It touched William's forehead with one frozen finger, and he felt something worse than cold seep into his skull. A presence. An intention. The beginning of a hunger that would never stop, never pause, never allow anything else to exist alongside it. His vision dimmed, not from cold, but from something inside him shutting down, being pushed aside, making room for what the Wendigo was planting in his mind. The hunger. The eternal, consuming hunger. Through fading consciousness, William heard more sounds. Not the Wendigo's scraping speech, but something else. Human voices, motorized sounds, the whoop 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 of helicopter rotors, the search and rescue team. They'd finally traced his GPS signal. They'd finally come. The Wendigo heard them too. It pulled back from William, head cocked, listening. Then it looked down at him with something that might have been amusement or might have been promise. "They'll find you alive," it said. "They'll take you away. They'll warm you up and feed you and think you survived." That too wide smile again. "But I'm already inside you now. Already planted. Growing. Waiting. 4 seasons. Maybe less. And then you'll understand. Then you'll feel the hunger. Then you'll come back here and you'll hunt with me. 2 Wendigos. Better hunts. More prey." It stepped back into the shadows of the dead forest, and William's last conscious thought before the rescue team found him was the terrible certainty that it was telling the truth, that something had taken root in his mind. Something that even now, as his body temperature climbed and his systems rebooted and his rational thoughts returned, whispered in a voice made of winter and want. Hungry. So hungry, always hungry. Forever. 3 months later, William Archer sat in his apartment in Duluth, staring at a meal he couldn't bring himself to eat. The doctors had declared his recovery miraculous. Severe hypothermia, they'd said. He'd been at 28 degrees core temperature when they'd found him, the lowest ever recorded in a survivor. By all rights, he should have died or at least suffered permanent damage. But William was fine. Better than fine. His doctors marveled at how quickly he'd recovered, how healthy all his vitals looked, how energetic he seemed despite the trauma. He'd filed his report carefully, editing out the impossible parts. He'd found evidence of Kayla Morrison's campsite. He'd gotten lost and experienced severe hypothermia. The search team had located him before it was too late. No mention of creatures. No mention of winter in July. No mention of hunger. They'd never found Kayla Morrison's body. They'd never found the bodies of the 3 before her. The Boundary Waters kept its secrets. William looked at his untouched dinner and felt nothing resembling appetite. Food tasted wrong now. Everything tasted wrong. Like it wasn't quite what his body needed. Like it couldn't possibly satisfy what was growing inside him. The calendar on his wall showed October 18th. 4 months since the incident. 4 months of feeling something change inside himself. Something fundamental shifting in his metabolism and his thoughts and his dreams. In his dreams, he walked through frozen forests. In his dreams, he hunted. In his dreams, he finally found something that satisfied the hunger. He wasn't hungry for food. Not anymore. William stood and walked to his window, looking north toward Superior National Forest, toward the Boundary Waters, toward the place where something was waiting for him, patient and knowing. The thing that had promised him 4 seasons. The thing that had planted itself in his mind like a seed that grew best in frozen soil. His reflection in the window glass looked back at him. Normal face, normal proportions, normal human features. But when he smiled, just for a moment in the dim light, his teeth looked sharper than they should have been, and his eyes held a color they'd never had before, a yellow-white, like old bone or ancient ice. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, and William Archer felt the hunger grow stronger, welcoming the cold like an old friend. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The hair was impossibly long. Nicole Valdez found it wrapped around the door handle of the Graves Creek Ranger Station, coiled like a black serpent, wet, despite 3 days without rain. She pulled her hand back before touching it, every instinct screaming wrong. In her 8 years with the National Park Service, she'd dealt with bear maulings, hypothermic hikers, and one memorable incident involving a rabid raccoon and a honeymoon couple. She'd never seen hair like this. It had to be 15 feet long, maybe more. The strands disappeared into the station itself, threading through the gap beneath the door. Nicole crouched, her knees protesting the movement. 42 felt closer to 62 after what happened at North Cascades. After what she saw. After what she failed to prevent. She didn't want to open that door. The October morning pressed against her back, unseasonably warm for the Olympic Peninsula. Fog clung to the old-growth Sitka spruces like something alive and patient. Nicole had transferred to Olympic National Park 6 months ago, hoping distance would quiet the nightmares. It hadn't worked. Every closed door held the possibility of finding another body. Every silence suggested something waiting just beyond perception. Tyler Dawson had been missing for 4 days. Nicole forced herself to stand, pulling the Motorola radio from her belt. The action was automatic, muscle memory from countless routine calls. Her fingers found the transmission button. Valdez to dispatch. I'm at Graves Creek Station. Something. I need backup before entering. Static answered. She tried again. Nothing. Her Garmin GPS showed her exact coordinates. 475883 again. 123.6156 W. Signal strength, 0. That shouldn't be possible this close to the station's repeater. The hair moved. Nicole's breath caught. She watched it slide against the weathered wood, pulling tighter around the handle. The movement was deliberate, purposeful, like fingers closing into a fist. She'd stopped believing in coincidences after North Cascades. After finding Melissa Hartley's body arranged in a circle of stones that no rational explanation could account for. After watching something that definitely wasn't a bear disappear into shadows that shouldn't have existed at noon. After the investigation concluded animal attack, while Nicole knew that animals don't draw symbols in blood. The hair was still moving. Nicole drew her service weapon, a Glock 22 that felt inadequate against something she couldn't name. Her left hand trembled as she reached for the door handle. The tremor had started 3 months after North Cascades and never fully stopped. The department psychologist called it post-traumatic stress. Nicole called it the only honest response her body could manage. The hair felt like ice. She jerked her hand away, but too late. The cold had already traveled up her arm, settling into her chest like frozen fingers around her heart. The door swung open on its own, hinges screaming. The hair pulled taut, then snapped, dissolving into mist that smelled of standing water and something else. Something Nicole recognized from the morgue. Decay. The station's interior looked untouched. Morning light filtered through dust motes suspended in perfect stillness. Tyler Dawson's day pack sat on the desk where he'd left it Tuesday morning, before heading up the Graves Creek Trail to check on reported rockfall damage. His coffee mug still held an inch of liquid grown fuzzy with mold. The calendar on the wall showed October 14th, 2014, circled in red marker. Trail maintenance, Wainuchi Pass, 12 miles. He'd never made it 12 miles. Nicole stepped inside, her boots loud against warped floorboards. The station dated back to the 1930s, built by the Civilian Conservation Corps. Solid construction, Douglas fir beams that would outlast the Republic. But something felt fundamentally wrong with the geometry. The room seemed deeper than it should be, the walls angling away from her vision whenever she looked directly at them. She was seeing things again, just like North Cascades, just like the 3 weeks of medical leave that followed, the psychiatric evaluations, the careful documentation of her episode. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 5 seconds. Nicole's breath plumed white. Frost crystallized across the windows, fractal patterns spreading with audible cracks. Her Glock felt heavy, useless. What do you shoot at cold? The smell intensified. Standing water, yes, but also specific. Hinoki cypress. She'd smelled it once before, years ago during a training rotation in Seattle's International District. An old woman burning incense outside a Buddhist temple, the smoke curling into incomprehensible shapes. Why would she smell cypress here? Nicole moved toward the desk, each step requiring conscious effort. Tyler's day pack beckoned with the promise of answers. She unzipped it with numb fingers. Standard gear, first aid kit, Nalgene bottle still half full, granola bars, topographic map of the Graves Creek watershed marked with his planned route. His park radio, turned off. And something else. Photographs. Nicole spread them across the desk. Polaroids, their colors fading with chemical instability. Each showed the same subject, a small clearing about a quarter-mile up the Graves Creek Trail. She recognized the distinctive split boulder marking mile 0.3, but the photographs showed the clearing across different time periods, different seasons, different decades judging by the clothing worn by the people in each image. People who were all dead. Nicole's hands began shaking worse. She recognized the postures, the way the bodies were arranged, seated upright against trees, hands folded in laps, heads tilted at impossible angles. The same arrangement she'd found Melissa Hartley in, the same positioning that the official report dismissed as predator activity. There were 14 photographs, 14 bodies, 14 deaths in the same clearing spanning what looked like 80 years. The earliest Polaroid showed a young woman in 1930s hiking attire. The most recent showed Tyler Dawson, still wearing his NPS uniform, seated against a western hemlock, eyes open and staring at nothing. The photograph was dated October 15, 2014. Tomorrow. Nicole's vision swam. The room tilted and she grabbed the desk to stay upright. This wasn't real. Couldn't be real. She was having another episode, another break from reality triggered by stress and unprocessed trauma. The department psychologist had warned her about. The hair reappeared. It emerged from beneath the desk, growing from nothing, spreading across the floor in a black tide. Strands thick as rope, thin as spider silk, all moving with unified purpose. They climbed the walls, covered the windows, plunged the station into darkness broken only by Nicole's flashlight. She ran. The door slammed shut before she reached it. Hair wrapped around her ankles, her wrists, her throat. Not choking, but holding. Stopping her. The cold intensified until Nicole couldn't feel her extremities. Her flashlight flickered, died, returned, showing something standing in the corner that hadn't been there before. A woman in white. No. Not standing. Hovering, 6 inches above the floor, long black hair hanging past her feet, obscuring her face. White kimono soaked through, dripping water that pooled without sound. The temperature plummeted further. Nicole's tears froze on her cheeks. The woman raised her head. Nicole screamed. The face was Tyler Dawson's. Then it wasn't. Features shifting, melting, reforming. A young woman from the 1930s. An elderly man from the 1950s. A teenage girl from the 1980s. 14 faces cycling through endless repetition, each one frozen in the moment of death. Mouths open, eyes empty, expressions of terminal understanding. The entity moved closer without moving at all, suddenly 3 feet away instead of 8. Nicole smelled cypress and standing water and the copper tang of blood. Her service weapon remained in her hand, forgotten. What do you shoot at the dead? Why? Nicole's voice cracked. Wrong question. She knew better. At North Cascades, she'd learned that asking why was how you got killed. The entity there hadn't cared about her questions, her need for understanding. It had simply existed, hungry and ancient, and utterly indifferent to human reason. This thing was different. It wanted her to ask. The entity's mouth opened, Tyler's mouth, wearing the wrong face, and sound emerged. Not words, not human speech. Something between wind through hollow trees and fingers scraping bone. But Nicole understood it anyway, the meaning bypassing language entirely and carving directly into her brain. Justice. For what? The question escaped before Nicole could stop it. The hair around her throat tightened fractionally. Not hurting. Warning. The entity shifted again and Nicole suddenly saw beyond it. The station walls became transparent, revealing the forest outside. But it was the wrong forest. Wrong time. She watched as scene after scene played out in rapid succession. 1934. A young woman hiking alone, encountering 3 men who decided the rules of civilization didn't apply in the wilderness. Her body arranged against a tree, made to look peaceful. Accidental fall, the coroner declared. Case closed. 1956. An elderly Japanese man, interned during the war, returning to the mountains he'd once loved. Found dead 3 days later, wallet missing. Heart attack, they said. Natural causes, 1972. A teenage girl running from something worse than the forest. Caught anyway. The clearing, her final sanctuary. Exposure, the report stated. No investigation necessary. The deaths continued, each one dismissed, each one forgotten, each one leaving a mark in reality that accumulated like scar tissue. The clearing became a wound in the world, and something noticed. Something old. Something that remembered every injustice because it was born from them. The entity showed Nicole more, showed her Tyler Dawson finding the photographs a week ago, tucked inside the station's old filing cabinet. Showed him researching, discovering the pattern, realizing the truth that no one else would believe. Showed him going to his supervisor, to the county sheriff, to anyone who might listen. Shown the door. Crazy, stressed, overworked. Take some time off, Tyler. Get some rest. So Tyler had gone to the clearing himself, camera in hand, determined to document what everyone else refused to see. He'd arrived at dawn 4 days ago, set up his equipment, and waited. The entity had been waiting longer. Nicole watched Tyler's final moments, watched him see something emerging from the morning mist. The woman in white, hair spreading like spilled ink. Watched him understand finally that some debts don't expire. Watched him try to run. Watched him die. Not from violence. From understanding. From seeing the accumulated weight of 80 years of injustice made manifest. His heart had simply stopped, unable to process the impossible made real. The entity had arranged his body with the others, adding him to the collection. Not malice. Ritual. Another witness to crimes that would never be punished. The visions ended. Nicole found herself on her knees, tears streaming. The hair had released her at some point. The entity hovered closer, its face cycling through the 14 dead with increasing speed. "What do you want from me?" Nicole whispered. The answer formed in her mind without words. Remembrance. They're dead. I can't bring them back. Not resurrection. Recognition. The entity wanted what it had always wanted. Acknowledgement that these deaths mattered. That they weren't accidents, weren't natural causes, weren't convenient closures to uncomfortable questions. Each person in that clearing had died because someone decided their life held less value than convenience. The entity wanted that truth spoken aloud. Nicole's radio suddenly crackled to life, making her jump. Dispatch's voice emerged through heavy static. "Repeat. All units respond to Graves Creek Station. Ranger Valdez hasn't checked in. Assume emergency situation." The entity watched her with 14 pairs of eyes. Nicole lifted the radio with numb fingers. She thought about North Cascades, about how she'd told the truth and been dismissed. She thought about Melissa Hartley, whose death report she'd challenged until threatened with termination. She thought about how the system protected itself by erasing inconvenient realities. She thought about Tyler Dawson, who'd tried to expose the truth and died for it. "Dispatch, this is Valdez." Her voice steadied. "I'm at Graves Creek Station. I found evidence related to Tyler Dawson's disappearance. Also evidence of 14 additional deaths spanning approximately 80 years, all occurring at the same location." Silence. Then, "Valdez, repeat? Did you say 14 deaths?" Affirmative. "All dismissed as accidents or natural causes. All showing signs of foul play that was systematically ignored. I'm requesting immediate investigation by county homicide and the FBI." "Nicole..." The dispatcher's voice softened, became careful. "Are you feeling all right? Do you need medical assistance?" There it was. The same concern as dismissal that had followed her from North Cascades. The gentle suggestion that she wasn't seeing reality, that trauma had broken something in her brain that made her perceive patterns where none existed. The entity's face stopped cycling. It wore Tyler's features now, frozen in the moment of terminal understanding. Nicole made her choice. "Dispatch, I'm documenting everything I've found. I'm going to the clearing where Tyler Dawson died. I'll collect physical evidence and photograph the scene. When I return, I'll file a formal report that will not be ignored. Nicole, please don't do anything. Nicole turned off the radio. The entity watched her with Tyler's dead eyes. She could feel its attention like weight, like judgment, like the ocean's pressure at incomprehensible depths. It could kill her as easily as it had killed Tyler. Easier. Instead, it moved aside. The station door opened. October sunlight spilled across warped floorboards, normal and warm and completely at odds with the temperature still freezing Nicole's breath. She stood slowly, her legs threatening to buckle. I'll tell them, she said to the entity. I'll make them listen. The woman in white tilted her head, an almost human gesture, almost curious. Then she was gone. The hair vanished. The temperature normalized in seconds. Nicole stood alone in an empty station that looked exactly as it had when she'd arrived, except for one detail. The 14 photographs were gone. No, not gone. Changed. Nicole stared at the desk where they'd been spread. New photographs had replaced them. Modern digital prints. Each showed the clearing. Each showed a different body. Each was dated with precision, including one dated October 15th, 2014, showing Tyler Dawson, and one dated October 16th, 2014, showing Nicole Valdez. Her hands began shaking again. Tomorrow. The entity had shown her tomorrow. She had 24 hours. Nicole grabbed Tyler's day pack and her own gear. The Graves Creek Trail waited outside, winding up through old-growth forest toward the clearing at mile 0.3, toward the place where 14 people had died across 80 years, toward the place that would claim her tomorrow unless she changed something fundamental, unless she made the truth matter more than her own survival. The forest swallowed her within minutes. Douglas firs rose like cathedral pillars, their canopy filtering sunlight into green-tinted dimness. The trail wound upward at a gentle grade, well-maintained, marked with standard NPS blazes every 100 yards. Normal. Safe. Except nothing about this was normal or safe. Nicole found the first sign at mile 0.1, a patch of moss growing in an impossible direction, climbing a tree trunk horizontally before turning straight down. She'd seen similar phenomena at North Cascades, places where reality bent around something it couldn't fully contain. At mile 0.2, the birds stopped singing. The silence pressed against her ears like depth pressure. Nicole's boots were loud on the packed earth trail. Too loud. She found herself walking more carefully, trying not to disturb the wrongness accumulating around her. The split boulder appeared at mile 0.25. Nicole stopped. The clearing lay just ahead, visible through the trees. Afternoon light slanted through the canopy, illuminating a space perhaps 30 feet across. Western hemlocks ringed it, their bark scarred with symbols Nicole didn't recognize. Japanese characters, maybe. Or something older. 14 trees. 14 bodies across 80 years. Tyler Dawson sat against the nearest hemlock exactly as shown in the photograph. His NPS uniform was clean, unwrinkled. No signs of violence, no decomposition despite 4 days of exposure. His eyes were open, staring at something above and beyond Nicole's perception. She approached slowly, knowing what she'd find. Knowing it wouldn't matter. The official report would read, heart attack, or natural causes, or some other convenient fiction. It always did. Nicole knelt beside Tyler's body. His skin was ice cold. She checked for pulse anyway. Nothing. His pupils were fixed and dilated. Time of death? Impossible to determine without a medical examiner, but probably 96 hours ago based on his last known location. Except he showed zero decomposition. Except the photographs showed him dying tomorrow. Except time itself seemed negotiable in this place. Nicole pulled out her digital camera and began documenting. She photographed Tyler from multiple angles. She photographed the clearing. She photographed the symbols carved into the trees. Intricate, deliberate, repeating certain patterns. She photographed everything because documentation was the only weapon she had against systematic erasure. The temperature dropped. Nicole didn't need to check her thermometer to know it was happening again. Her breath plumed white. Frost crystallized across the fallen leaves covering the forest floor. The light changed, dimming, as if the sun had suddenly decided sunset came 6 hours early. The woman in white materialized directly in front of Tyler's body. This close, Nicole could see details she'd missed in the station. The kimono was silk, once expensive, now rotted through in places. The hair wasn't just black. It held colors that didn't have names, shifting between absolute darkness and something that hurt to perceive. The woman's feet didn't quite align with the ground, hovering in that 6-inch gap between what was and what should be. Her face cycled through the 14 dead faster now. So fast the features blurred into something almost fractal, a pattern repeating at every scale until it broke Nicole's ability to focus. Then the entity stopped on a face Nicole hadn't seen before. A young Japanese woman, probably late 20s, wearing clothes from the 1940s. Her expression showed no fear, no anger, just absolute certainty. Recognition hit Nicole like physical impact. This was what the entity had been before injustice, before death, before becoming something that existed to remember what everyone else forgot. The entity spoke, and this time Nicole heard actual words mixed with that wind-through-bone sound. Akiko Matsuda, March 17th, 1942. A date Nicole knew. Everyone knew that date, whether they admitted it or not. Executive Order 9066, the beginning of internment. The official erasure of American citizens deemed insufficiently American. You were interned. Nicole's voice barely rose above a whisper. The entity's face remained Akiko Matsuda's. Tule Lake. Family lost everything. Shop, home, future. Released 1945. Returned here. To forest I loved before country decided I was enemy. What happened? Hiking alone. Met 3 men, veterans. Angry about war, about Pacific Theater, about things they needed to blame on someone who looked like enemy. Akiko's face flickered, showing pain for the first time. They hurt me, left me in clearing, arranged my body to look peaceful, to look like I chose this end. Nicole's chest tightened. No one investigated. Japanese woman dead in woods? Akiko's laugh was bitter, ancient. Ruled suicide. Case closed. Family told I was unstable. War trauma. Better to forget. And you couldn't forget. I couldn't leave. Akiko gestured at the clearing, and Nicole suddenly saw it differently. Saw the accumulated anger of 80 years crystallized into something almost geological. I stayed. I watched. I saw others come. Others the world decided didn't matter enough to investigate properly. Each death, another wound. Each dismissal, another scar. So you started collecting them? Remembering them, Akiko corrected. Their deaths mattered. They deserved to matter. If authorities wouldn't give them justice, I would give them remembrance. Nicole understood now. The photographs. The bodies arranged like exhibits. The entity forcing witnesses to see what had been systematically ignored. Not revenge, memorial. Tyler Dawson tried to expose this, Nicole said. He tried to make people see. And they called him crazy. Akiko's face hardened. Same word they used for you after North Cascades. After you found Melissa Hartley and told truth no one wanted to hear. Nicole flinched. How do you know about... I know all injustices in these mountains. I am them. Akiko moved closer and Nicole smelled cypress and standing water. You understand. You have seen beyond comfortable lies. You know price of truth. Then why... Nicole gestured at the photograph dated October 16th showing her own body. Why kill me too? Not kill. Witness. Akiko's expression softened fractionally. You can choose. You can walk away, file report that will be dismissed, continue working for system that erases uncomfortable realities. Or you can stay. You can see everything. You can become testimony that cannot be ignored. Nicole's throat went dry. Become testimony means dying. means transforming, means joining us in place between forgotten and remembered, means becoming evidence system cannot erase. Akiko gestured at the trees, and Nicole saw them clearly now. All 14 victims, transparent and watching. We are proof. We are documentation. We are what remains when official records lie. The other spirits became more solid. Nicole recognized them from the photographs. The young woman from the 1930s, the elderly man from the 1950s, the teenage girl from the 1970s. Tyler Dawson stood among them, his expression peaceful now. They were offering her a choice. Die trying to convince a system designed to dismiss her, or die becoming permanent evidence of that system's failures. Nicole thought about her 8 years with the National Park Service, about the countless incident reports that disappeared into bureaucratic void, about Melissa Hartley's case, closed despite her formal protests, about Tyler Dawson, who'd tried every proper channel before coming here alone, about how the living could rationalize anything, but the dead couldn't be ignored forever. If I join you, Nicole said slowly, what happens? You become guardian of this place. You witness new injustices. You preserve evidence in forms that transcend official channels. Akiko's hair shifted, and Nicole saw images in the strands. Documentaries yet to be made, investigations yet to be opened, truths yet to emerge. Your death would have meaning. Your existence would have purpose. And if I leave? You file your report. It is dismissed. You are placed on administrative leave for psychiatric evaluation. Eventually, you resign or are terminated. Tyler's death is ruled natural causes. These 14 murders remain officially unsolved accidents. Akiko's gaze intensified. And you spend rest of your life knowing you chose comfortable lie over difficult truth. Nicole looked at Tyler's spirit. He nodded slightly, acknowledging the impossible choice. She thought about her apartment in Port Angeles, sparsely furnished because she'd never really unpacked after North Cascades, about her strained relationship with her family, who thought she should let go of her obsession with Melissa Hartley, about her complete lack of social life, friends, connections, all sacrificed to a job that demanded her silence as the price of employment. What exactly would she be leaving? How does it work? Nicole asked. Akiko extended her hand. Up close, Nicole saw the fingers were wrong, too many joints bending at impossible angles. You take my hand. You step into clearing. You accept what you cannot change. Your body stops. Your consciousness remains. You become testimony. Does it hurt? Less than living with lies. Akiko's expression was almost kind. Tyler did not suffer. None of us suffered in transformation. The pain was in dying before, in injustice itself. This is relief. Nicole's hand trembled as she reached out. Her fingers hovered inches from Akiko's impossible hand. She thought about the photograph dated October 16, 2014, showing her body arranged against a tree. Tomorrow. A day she could avoid by simply walking away. A day that felt inevitable regardless. Her radio crackled. Valdez, this is dispatch. Your supervisor is requesting immediate return to headquarters. We're sending units to your last known location. Please respond. They were coming to bring her back, to file the report that mattered more than truth, to protect the system from uncomfortable questions. Nicole turned off the radio. She looked at Akiko's extended hand, at Tyler's peaceful spirit, at 14 victims transformed into permanent witnesses. She stepped into the clearing. The temperature plummeted so fast her blood felt like ice in her veins. Nicole gasped, and her breath emerged as something solid, crystallizing in the air. Akiko's hand closed around hers, and Nicole felt reality bend. Time became negotiable. She saw the clearing across 80 years simultaneously, saw Akiko's murder in 1945, saw each subsequent death layer upon layer, palimpsest of injustice. Saw Tyler Dawson's final moments. Saw her own body tomorrow, arranged against a western hemlock, eyes open and staring at truth. Saw herself standing beside that body, transparent and witnessing. The transformation felt like drowning in reverse. Not suffocation, but sudden, overwhelming clarity. Nicole's consciousness expanded beyond the comfortable boundaries of self. She felt Akiko's memories, Tyler's final understanding, all 14 victims' accumulated knowledge. She understood now, really understood. They weren't ghosts haunting a place. They were the place itself, transformed into living testimony. The clearing had become archive, memorial, proof. Physical laws bent around it because it represented something more fundamental than physics, the permanent record of human cruelty's intersection with cosmic indifference. Nicole's heart beat slower, slower. She felt it winding down like a clock reaching the end of its mainspring. No pain, just cessation, just the gentle transition from breathing to not breathing, from living to witnessing. Her last living thought was clarity itself. I choose truth over comfort. Then her heart stopped, and Nicole Valdez opened her eyes that had never closed, standing 6 inches above ground that had never left, seeing everything that had always been there but required death to perceive. The other 14 spirits welcomed her. Tyler smiled. Akiko released her hand, which was now as impossible as Akiko's own. What happens now? Nicole asked, her voice whined through hollow trees. Now we wait, Akiko said. We witness, we preserve, and eventually, maybe next year, maybe next decade, someone will come who actually listens. Someone will investigate properly. Someone will expose the pattern we've documented. And if no one comes, then we remain. Permanent record, eternal testimony. Akiko gestured at the clearing, and Nicole saw it transform into something between memorial and museum. The dead cannot be silenced like the living. We have patience. Nicole looked at her body, which wouldn't be found until morning when the search teams arrived. They would rule it heart attack, natural causes, stress-related cardiac event. They would reference her history at North Cascades, her psychological evaluations, her pattern of seeing connections that made colleagues uncomfortable. They would bury her next to unrelated graves and consider the case closed. But Nicole would remain here, transformed into evidence that would outlast any report. She felt the clearing's power growing with each witness added to its archive. 15 spirits now. 15 testimonies. 15 pieces of proof that some injustices transcended official channels. Time passed differently now. Nicole watched seasons cycle, search teams come and go, her body discovered and removed and processed and buried. She watched her supervisor file reports emphasizing her mental health history, watched her apartment emptied, her possessions donated, her existence reduced to footnote. And she watched October 16, 2015 arrive, 1 year later. A young ranger named Kevin Park stood at the clearing's edge, staring at symbols carved in trees. He'd found Tyler Dawson's hidden research, the files everyone else dismissed. He'd followed the trail despite orders to let it go. Nicole felt Akiko stir, felt all 15 spirits focus their collective attention on this new arrival. Kevin pulled out his phone, began photographing everything. His hands shook, but he didn't stop. He saw something in the patterns, something that mattered. Maybe this was the one who would listen. Maybe 15 witnesses were finally enough. Nicole stepped toward him, not to frighten, not to harm, just to witness, to document, to add her testimony to the permanent record that truth existed, even when convenient lies prevailed. Kevin's phone captured her image, transparent, hovering, undeniable. He stumbled backward, terrified, but he didn't delete the photo, didn't run. He stood there, shaking, and took 17 more pictures. Then he left, and Nicole knew with the certainty of the dead, that this time would be different. This time someone would listen. The photograph dated October 16, 2014 had shown her body, but it hadn't shown the whole truth. Because Nicole Valdez hadn't ended. She'd transformed into something the system couldn't erase. Evidence incarnate. Testimony eternal. Proof that some debts don't expire. The clearing grew colder as autumn deepened into winter. The 15 spirits maintained their vigil, patient and permanent, waiting for the truth they preserved to finally matter more than the comfortable lies people preferred. And in Port Angeles, Kevin Park uploaded 17 photographs to servers far beyond one supervisor's ability to delete. The permanent record was building. The dead were patient. Justice might take decades. But remembrance was eternal. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened.